Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. Last month, I had a pretty unsettling experience that I've been trying to process. It all started one night when my dishwasher suddenly gave out. I'm not handy with tools, so I called a home repair service I found online. They said they could send someone out that same night, which I thought was convenient. Around 8 p.m., a repairman showed up at my door. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s. His uniform looked clean but a bit wrinkled. He introduced himself as Jim and immediately started walking past me and into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. I found it a little odd but didn't think too much of it at the time. Jim asked a lot of questions as he worked. At first, it was about the dishwasher, which made sense. But then he started asking about how long I'd lived in the house, if I lived alone, and how long I'd been working at my job. I answered politely but was uncomfortable with how personal his questions were getting. I kept my answers vague. As he worked on the dishwasher, he started making comments about how quiet my neighborhood was. He mentioned it seemed like a nice place to live, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I told him I liked the quiet but didn't say much else. Jim's mannerisms began to feel increasingly intrusive. He would brush up against me a bit too often, and every time I moved to another part of the kitchen, he'd follow close behind. I could tell he was trying to make small talk, but it felt forced and uncomfortable. The real alarm bells started ringing when he asked if I had any plans for the weekend. I told him I was planning to catch up on some reading and relax. He seemed overly interested and kept asking what kind of books I liked, where I liked to go to read, and even what kind of tea I preferred. I started feeling trapped. It was just the two of us in the house, and he was getting way too personal. I glanced at the clock and realized he'd been there for nearly an hour. The repair wasn't supposed to take this long. I tried to casually ask how much longer it would be until he was done, hoping to speed up the process. Jim gave a vague answer about needing to check a few more things, and then he started fiddling with tools that didn't seem necessary. I could tell he was delaying on purpose. My unease grew with each minute, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to make a phone call to a friend, pretending I was just checking in. I kept my conversation brief and purposefully loud so that Jim could hear me. I mentioned I was having a repair done and that I was glad my friend could help me if needed. I hoped this would make him feel like he was being watched or that someone knew he was there. Jim seemed to take the hint. He started packing up his tools more quickly and wrapped up his work. Before leaving, he tried to get my number and offered to come back if I had any more issues. I declined, and when he left, I made sure to lock the door behind him. After he left, I checked the area where he had been working. Everything seemed fine with the dishwasher, but the experience left me feeling unsettled. I went to bed that night with every light on and kept checking the locks on my doors. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I went online to check if there were any reviews for the repair service. I found several complaints about strange behavior and unprofessional conduct. It made my skin crawl. I felt a rush of relief that nothing worse had happened, but also a deep sense of anger and violation. I reported my experience to the company, and they assured me they'd look into it. They offered an apology and said they would take action against the employee. I haven't heard from them since, and I'm not sure if I'll ever use a service like that again. The whole ordeal has made me more cautious about who I let into my home. I learned a hard lesson about trusting strangers and being aware of the red flags. It started with a notification. I was sitting on my couch one night, scrolling through my phone, when I saw a new like on an old photo of mine. Nothing unusual, just a simple heart icon. But then, I saw another like from the same person. And another. They were liking posts from years ago, all in one go. At first, I didn't think much of it. People get curious, right? They scroll through old photos. But then I noticed the comments. They were odd. One read, "You look so happy here. I hope you're still doing well." Another said, "This was one of your best days, wasn't it?" The comments felt oddly personal, like they knew something about me that they shouldn't. I checked the profile of the person commenting. It was a private account with no posts, and the name didn't ring any bells. I debated whether to block them, but decided to wait and see if it continued. Over the next few days, the activity increased. The comments grew more unsettling. "I see you're still living in the same place. I bet you're in that coffee shop right now." The worst part was the message I received directly. "I know where you are. I see you." That's when I started to get anxious. I mentioned it to a few close friends, but they brushed it off as someone messing around. I tried to keep calm, thinking it might just be a prank or a bot. Then one night, while heading home from work, I saw someone walking behind me on the sidewalk. They seemed to be keeping a good distance, but were clearly following me. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. When I got home, I checked my phone. The same profile had liked a recent photo of me at the office. It was becoming increasingly clear that this person was watching my movements. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I looked up the profile's details again and found nothing useful. It was a dead end. I started to feel trapped in my own home. The idea of someone knowing where I was all the time was terrifying. I decided to confront this person. I went to a local cafe where I had seen the profile's comments mentioned a few times. It was a popular spot, so I thought it might be a good place to catch them if they were nearby. I didn't know what to expect, but felt I had to do something. I arrived at the cafe around the same time I usually go. I kept my eyes open for anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to me. As I sat down with my coffee, I noticed a man sitting across the room, glancing in my direction. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around. It was him. I could tell from his demeanor and the way he looked at me. I mustered up the courage to approach him. I walked over and said, "I think you've been following me on social media and making comments." "Why?" The man's face went pale. He stuttered and tried to explain himself, but his words were jumbled. He said he had been curious about my life and wanted to reach out, but didn't know how to do it properly. He claimed he meant no harm, but his shaky voice and the fear in his eyes said otherwise. I told him I didn't want any contact and that I would be reporting him. As I turned to leave, I felt a surge of relief. But that relief was short-lived. As I walked back to my car, I noticed the man was now following me, trying to keep his distance but clearly tailing me. I reached my car and quickly locked the doors, feeling my heart race. I watched as he walked past and then hurriedly drove off. I made sure to take a different route home, checking my rearview mirror to see if I was being followed. When I got home, I reported the profile to the social media platform and also filed a report with the local police, providing them with all the information I had. I was scared, but I felt a bit better knowing I had taken steps to protect myself. Over the next few weeks, the strange activity stopped. The profile was taken down, and the comments ceased. I still feel uneasy about it all, but I'm grateful nothing worse happened. I learned to be more cautious online and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The experience has left me more aware of my surroundings and more protective of my personal space. I hope I never have to deal with something like this again. The first few nights in my new apartment were pretty quiet. I had moved into this small, old building that looked charming enough. Everything seemed normal until I met my neighbor, Tom, who lived next door. Tom was friendly at first. He came by on my second day to introduce himself and bring over a plate of cookies. I thought it was a nice gesture, and he seemed like a pleasant enough guy. He talked a lot about the building and the neighborhood, and I appreciated the local tips. But soon, Tom's friendliness started to feel a bit off. He began popping by unannounced, just to check in or see how I was doing. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just trying to be neighborly. But then the visits started to get more frequent and less casual. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when Tom knocked on my door. He said he had noticed I was out late the previous night and asked if everything was okay. I told him I was fine and had just been working late. He seemed overly concerned and wouldn't leave until I reassured him. I tried to brush it off, but then I started noticing other things. Tom seemed to know I was coming and going. I'd see him out of the corner of my eye watching from his window as I left for work or came home. It was unsettling, but nothing I could directly confront him about. One night, around 9 p.m., I was getting ready for bed when I heard a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Tom standing there. I hesitated but opened the door. He was holding a package that he said had been delivered to his apartment by mistake. I thanked him and took it, but something about the way he was lingering made me uncomfortable. A few days later, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. It said, "I hope you're settling in well. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." There was no signature, but it was clearly from Tom. The note seemed overly personal and a little creepy. Things escalated quickly after that. Tom started making comments about things he couldn't possibly know. He'd mention my favorite shows, comment on my plants, and even reference the meals I cooked, all of which he must have learned by peeking through my window or overhearing conversations. The worst was when he started showing up at odd hours, knocking on my door. One night, I was working late and heard a knock at 1 a.m. I looked through the peephole and saw Tom standing there, his face pressed against the door. I ignored it, hoping he'd go away, but he kept knocking and calling my name. The next day, I noticed Tom had installed a new doorbell camera on his door. It felt like an invasion of privacy, even though it wasn't directly pointed at my apartment. I knew he had the means to watch me even more closely now. I began to feel trapped in my own apartment. I would leave the lights on and try to avoid being alone. I made a habit of calling a friend or family member whenever I left my apartment, just so someone knew where I was. One evening, I decided to take action. I called the landlord and expressed my concerns about Tom's behavior. The landlord seemed sympathetic but didn't offer much help, saying that Tom had been living in the building for years and had always been a good tenant. Feeling frustrated and scared, I decided to take things into my own hands. I started documenting every incident, keeping a log of dates, times, and details of Tom's behavior. I also installed my own security camera in my apartment, pointing towards the door and windows. One night, while reviewing the footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tom was outside my door, trying to peer through the gaps. He was wearing dark clothing and seemed to be trying to avoid the camera. I decided it was time to involve the police. I provided them with the footage and all the notes and logs I had collected. They took the matter seriously and spoke with Tom. They warned him about his behavior and the need to respect my privacy. Tom backed off after that. The visits stopped, and the weird notes ceased. For a while, I still felt on edge, expecting him to show up at any moment. But gradually, things returned to a semblance of normalcy. I eventually moved out of that apartment. It wasn't just Tom's behavior that drove me away, it was the constant anxiety and feeling of being watched. The new place I found is much better, and I've made sure to keep my distance from overly inquisitive neighbors. Looking back, I'm grateful I took the steps I did. It's terrifying how quickly something as simple as a neighborly gesture can go south. It all started one night when I received a call from someone claiming to be from my bank. The call seemed legitimate enough. The person on the other end had a professional tone and knew some details about my account. They said there had been some suspicious activity and needed to verify my information for security purposes. I didn't think much of it. I had recently used my card a lot for online purchases, and it made sense that my bank might want to check in. The caller asked for my account number, social security number, and other personal details. I gave them everything they asked for, thinking it was standard procedure. Later that night, I checked my email and saw that I had received several alerts from my bank about large transactions and withdrawals. My heart sank when I saw the amounts. Someone had drained my account completely. I rushed to my online banking app, but it was too late. All my money was gone. I immediately called my bank using the number on the back of my card, not the one from the call. The bank representative confirmed my worst fears. The call I received was a phishing scam. They had tricked me into giving away my information. I was devastated. The next few days were a nightmare. I spent hours on the phone with my bank, filling out forms, and trying to reverse the fraudulent charges. They assured me they would investigate, but the process was slow and tedious. I felt helpless and violated. On top of the financial mess, I started receiving threatening calls and emails. They were from unknown numbers and addresses. Some messages claimed they knew personal details about me and warned me to stay out of their business. It felt like I was being stalked. I filed a report with the police, but without much to go on, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay vigilant and be cautious with my personal information. I felt like I was in a constant state of paranoia. To make matters worse, my credit score took a hit from the fraudulent activity. I was locked out of several accounts and had to deal with identity theft protection services. They helped, but the damage was already done. One night, as I was trying to get some rest, I heard my phone ring. It was an unknown number. I hesitated but answered. The voice on the other end was threatening, demanding money to stop the harassment. I hung up and blocked the number, but the calls kept coming. I started receiving letters in the mail from various debt collectors and financial institutions, all claiming I owed money I didn't recognize. It felt like my entire life was unraveling. Despite the chaos, I kept pushing forward, working with my bank and the authorities to resolve the issues. I had to change all my passwords, set up new security measures, and constantly monitor my accounts for any suspicious activity. Eventually, after months of back and forth, my bank managed to recover some of the stolen funds. They were able to reverse most of the fraudulent transactions, but the emotional and financial damage was already done. The threats eventually stopped, though the memory of those harrowing nights still lingers. I learned to be incredibly cautious with any call asking for personal information, no matter how official it may sound. In the end, I managed to rebuild my life and restore my financial stability, but it took a lot of effort and time. The experience taught me to always verify the identity of anyone requesting sensitive information and to trust my instincts when something feels off. It all started one night when I got home from work. I found a package on my doorstep. It wasn't anything fancy, just a plain cardboard box, but it had my name on it. I didn't recognize the sender. I brought the package inside, curious. It was addressed to me, but it was clearly intended for someone else. The label was all smudged and worn. I checked the return address. It seemed like a random warehouse out of state. After some thought, I decided to call the number on the label to figure out what to do with it. A man answered after a few rings. He had a gruff voice and sounded slightly annoyed that I was calling. I told him I had received a package that didn't belong to me. He asked me for the tracking number and a description of the package. I gave him the details. He said someone would come by to pick it up soon and that I should hold on to it for now. I agreed, thinking it was no big deal. A couple of hours later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a man in a black hoodie. He looked nervous and kept glancing around. He said he was there to collect a package. I handed it over, and he didn't say much. Just took the box and left quickly. I didn't think much of it until the next night when I got another call from the same number. The man's voice was more urgent this time. He told me there was a mistake. He insisted I still had the package and needed to return it immediately. I was confused and told him I had given it to the man who came to pick it up. He started shouting, accusing me of keeping the package and threatening me if I didn't return it. I was scared and didn't know what to do. I told him I'd check my apartment again. I went through my place, checking every corner. There was no sign of the package. I called him back to explain. His response was chilling. He said if I didn't have it, then I was in trouble because it meant someone had stolen it. He threatened me with legal action and worse if I didn't comply. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what he had said. I had a gut feeling that something was very wrong. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside my window. I looked out and saw a shadowy figure near my car. I couldn't make out much, but it felt unsettling. The next morning, I found my car had been broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, but there were strange footprints around it. I reported it to the police, but they said it might be a random act of vandalism. Later that day, I received another package, this time directly addressed to me. Inside was a laptop with a note that said, "We need to talk." The laptop was loaded with surveillance footage of my apartment and a list of personal details about me. I was terrified. I tried calling the police again, but they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. I decided to take the laptop to a tech expert for analysis. He found hidden files that seemed to be tracking my movements and had timestamps of when I was home. I tried contacting the sender again, but this time, there was no response. I felt trapped, like someone was watching me at every turn. I decided to make sure my home was secure. I installed cameras and changed all my locks. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of me taken from outside my apartment, with a message saying, "Stop playing games." I was on edge, feeling paranoid and unsafe. Finally, after a week of escalating threats and harassment, the police managed to track down the individuals involved. It turned out the package was part of a larger operation involving stolen goods. The criminals had been using fake returns to cover their tracks. The suspects were arrested, and I was left with the aftermath of the invasion. I had to change my phone number, update all my security settings, and deal with the anxiety of having been targeted. In the end, I managed to regain some sense of normalcy, but the experience left me wary of accepting packages or dealing with unknown callers. I'll never forget that night. It was supposed to be a regular party, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd spent the whole day getting everything ready, setting up lights, arranging snacks, and making sure the music was just right. By the time the guests started arriving, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Around 9 p.m., the place was packed. People were mingling, having a good time. I was busy making sure everyone had drinks and was comfortable. That's when I noticed him, an unfamiliar guy standing by the kitchen, sipping from a cup. He didn't look like anyone I'd invited. I approached him and asked if he was a friend of someone. He just gave me a fake smile and said he was friends with the host. I was taken aback but figured maybe he was a plus one of my friends, so I let it slide. As the night went on, this guy kept popping up in different places. I saw him in the living room, then outside by the fire pit, and even in the bathroom. Each time, he seemed to be watching people. His behavior was strange, but I tried to ignore it and focus on making sure my guests were having fun. By around midnight, the party was still going strong. People were dancing, laughing, and enjoying themselves. I saw the uninvited guest again, but this time he was closer to the center of the group. He was standing too close to some of the guests, making them uncomfortable. I tried to intervene, asking him if he was okay and if he needed anything. His response was odd. He said he was just observing and that he liked to watch people interact. It was unsettling, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I tried to steer him toward a quieter part of the house, hoping he'd leave on his own. At this point, things took a turn for the worse. The guy's behavior became erratic. He started making strange comments to people, saying things like, "I can see what you're really like and you can't hide from me." His tone was menacing, and it was starting to get to everyone. I noticed a few of my friends were visibly uncomfortable. Some even tried to avoid him, but he seemed to follow them around. When I confronted him again, he got defensive and aggressive, claiming I was ruining his fun. His mood swings were unpredictable, and I could sense something was seriously wrong. The situation escalated quickly. He started shouting at random guests, accusing them of things that didn't make any sense. People were getting anxious, and a few left early, trying to avoid any further conflict. I tried to calm things down, but the guy was becoming increasingly hostile. I decided to call the police, hoping they could help defuse the situation. While I was on the phone with them, the guy noticed and grew even more agitated. He started pacing around the room, muttering to himself, and then threw a lamp against the wall. The room went silent, and everyone was watching in fear. The police arrived within 15 minutes, but by then, the situation was chaotic. The guy had barricaded himself in the bathroom and was threatening to harm anyone who tried to come near. The officers tried to negotiate with him, but he wouldn't listen. He was completely unhinged. Eventually, the police managed to get him out of the bathroom and arrest him. He put up a fight, but they got him under control. The whole ordeal felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. My friends and I were shaken, and the party was completely ruined. After the police left with the uninvited guest, I had to clean up the mess and make sure everyone was okay. Some people were too scared to stay, so they left immediately. The ones who remained were still in shock, trying to process what had just happened. In the days that followed, I learned that the guy had a history of mental health issues and had been in and out of trouble before. It was a relief that no one was hurt, but the whole experience left me deeply unsettled. I had to reassess my trust in people and be more cautious in the future. I hope I never have to go through something like that again. I thought it was just another late-night drive home when my car broke down. It was past midnight, and I was on a remote stretch of road with nothing but trees on either side. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the dark. I was alone, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I pulled over to the side, tried the ignition a few more times, but nothing worked. I knew I needed help, so I called a towing service, but it was going to take at least an hour. I sat in the car, trying to stay calm, but with every passing minute, my anxiety grew. About 15 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled up beside me. The driver, a man in his mid-40s with a rough look about him, got out and approached my window. He introduced himself as a local mechanic. He said he'd seen my car and was heading home but could take a look if I wanted. I was relieved and agreed, thinking this would be the best solution. He checked under the hood and gave me a reassuring smile. He told me it was a serious issue and that it would be best to get my car to his workshop for proper repairs. I was hesitant. It was late, and I was alone, but I didn't have many options. I agreed to follow him, hoping he was genuinely trying to help. The mechanic led me to his truck and said he'd give me a ride to his workshop. I followed in my car, keeping a close eye on the road. As we drove, I noticed the area around us was becoming more isolated. The trees were dense, and there were fewer streetlights. I started to feel uneasy but tried to push the thought away. We arrived at a small, dimly lit workshop tucked away off the main road. It looked more like an abandoned building than a place of business. The mechanic told me it would be best to leave my car here for the night, and he'd have it fixed by morning. I was already feeling anxious but agreed to the plan, figuring it was my only option. As soon as we entered the workshop, I noticed several other men in the back. They were hanging around, talking quietly. The mechanic introduced them as his team, saying they would help with the repairs. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. The men were eyeing me suspiciously, and their demeanor made me uncomfortable. The mechanic asked me to sit in a small office area while they worked on my car. He said it would take a while, and I should try to relax. I sat there, trying to make sense of the situation, but my gut was telling me something was off. After about 20 minutes, one of the men came into the office. He was holding a crowbar and had a menacing look on his face. He started asking me questions about my personal life, where I lived, and what kind of valuables I had. I tried to keep my answers vague, but my fear was growing. It was then that I realized the situation was much more serious than a simple car repair. The men had started moving around the workshop, and I heard the clinking of metal and the sound of drawers being opened. My heart raced as I began to understand that they were preparing to rob me. The mechanic returned and started talking in a low voice with the others. I could hear snippets of their conversation, and it became clear they were planning to take my car, my belongings, and possibly something worse. They were clearly not interested in repairing my vehicle. I had to think fast. My phone was in my bag, but I couldn't risk them seeing me call for help. I decided to act like I needed to use the restroom and asked the mechanic if I could go. He reluctantly agreed and led me to a small, grimy bathroom at the back of the workshop. Once inside, I locked the door and quickly dialed 911. I whispered the situation into the phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The operator assured me help was on the way. I knew I had to buy some time. When I came out of the bathroom, I pretended everything was fine. I made small talk with the mechanic, trying to keep him distracted. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the windows, hoping to see the flashing lights of police cars. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens approaching. The workshop was suddenly filled with the sound of police officers shouting and commanding everyone to get on the ground. The men in the workshop panicked, and chaos ensued. I saw the mechanic and his associates being arrested and taken away in handcuffs. An officer came over to me, asking if I was okay. I explained everything, and he assured me I was safe now. I was shaken but relieved. They called a tow truck for my car and made sure I got home safely. As I drove away from the workshop, I glanced back and saw the workshop's grim exterior receding into the distance. The fear and adrenaline were slowly fading, replaced by exhaustion. I knew I'd been lucky to get out of there unscathed. I never imagined house sitting could turn into a nightmare. I was asked to watch over my friend's place while they were away for a week. It was a nice house, set in a quiet neighborhood. I was just there to water the plants and collect the mail. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first. The first few days went by smoothly. I stayed there every night, enjoyed the peace and quiet, and made sure to follow all of my friend's instructions. But one evening, as I was going through the house to check on things, I noticed something odd in the living room. There was a small, black object tucked behind a potted plant on the shelf. It looked like a camera. At first, I thought it might be a security camera. My friend had mentioned a security system, but this camera was not part of the system I had seen when I checked earlier. I moved the plant and took a closer look. It wasn't just a camera, it was a hidden one, with a tiny lens pointing directly at the room. I felt a shiver down my spine. I started searching the house more thoroughly, and it didn't take long to find another camera hidden in the bedroom, and then another in the bathroom. They were cleverly disguised but placed in locations where they could see most of the house. I was stunned. Why would my friend have these cameras? And more importantly, why were they hidden? My mind raced with possibilities. I felt uneasy and decided to call my friend to ask about the cameras. Their phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining why I had found and asking for clarification. I hoped it was just some misunderstanding or a technical glitch. The next night, I decided to stay awake and keep watch. I was too uneasy to sleep. I went through the house again, checking all the hidden cameras I had found. I even tried to disable them, but they were wired into the house's electrical system. It was more complicated than I had anticipated. I heard a noise coming from the front door, like someone was trying to unlock it. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a shadowy figure standing on the other side. My first thought was to call the police, but my phone had no signal in the house. The figure moved away from the door, and I heard footsteps retreating. I waited for what felt like hours, but no one came back. I was on edge, constantly checking the cameras and the doors. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning, I decided to confront my friend. I went outside to see if there was a signal by the road. I called them again, but they didn't answer. Frustrated, I sent a text explaining that something was seriously wrong and that I needed to speak with them immediately. By late afternoon, my friend still hadn't responded. I was beginning to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I had no idea who had placed the cameras or why, but I knew I had to do something. I gathered my things and decided to leave, hoping to get to a safe place and call for help. As I was packing up, I noticed that the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I hadn't gone down there before, and my friend had never mentioned it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. The basement was dark and musty. I used the flashlight to see, and to my horror, I found more cameras, recording equipment, and even a computer set up with live feeds from all the cameras around the house. I was horrified. It wasn't just a couple of hidden cameras, it was a full surveillance system. I quickly realized that someone had been monitoring me. The realization hit me hard, and I felt a wave of panic. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps coming from the basement stairs. My blood ran cold. I ducked behind a shelf and held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder and closer. I could hear someone moving around, clearly searching for something or someone. I had to think fast. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy metal object, and prepared myself. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. The door to the basement creaked open, and I could see a shadow moving around. I had no idea who it was, but they were clearly not friendly. In a moment of desperation, I bolted for the door. I sprinted out of the house and jumped into my car. I drove away as fast as I could, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I headed straight to the nearest police station, feeling both relieved and terrified. I explained everything to the officers, and they took my report seriously. They sent a team to my friend's house to investigate. I waited at the station, trying to calm down. I was shaken but relieved to have finally reached out for help. Eventually, the police called me with an update. They had found evidence that someone had been using the house for illegal surveillance. My friend was apparently unaware of the setup. It turned out that the house had been rented out to someone else who had set up the cameras without permission. They were trying to find out who was behind it all. I never heard from my friend during that week, but they did reach out later to thank me for reporting the situation. They were as shocked as I was and assured me they had no knowledge of the surveillance system. The whole experience left me deeply unsettled. I felt violated and terrified that someone had been watching me so closely. I was driving home late one night, just after midnight, on a quiet road. The kind of road where the only sound is your engine and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was supposed to be a routine drive. I had just finished a long shift at work and was exhausted, but I wanted to get home as quickly as possible. Out of nowhere, a car suddenly swerved into my lane and hit me. The impact was jarring. I lost control and skidded to a stop on the shoulder. My heart was racing. I could see the other car had pulled over too, not too far ahead. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He looked disheveled and oddly calm, considering what had just happened. I gathered myself and got out of my car. My mind was racing. I was in shock and trying to piece together what had just happened. I walked towards the man, who was now standing by his car with a worried expression on his face. He approached me with an apologetic look. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I think so," I replied, still trying to steady my nerves. "What happened?" He explained that he had been distracted and didn't see me until it was too late. He offered to exchange insurance information. I hesitated but agreed, trying to stay calm and collected. As I was pulling out my phone to call the police and document the accident, the man's demeanor started to shift. He seemed more anxious now. He kept glancing around as if he was expecting something. My instincts told me something was off, but I tried to brush it aside. The man suddenly mentioned that his phone was dead and asked if he could use mine to call for a tow truck. I was a bit wary but agreed, handing him my phone. He made a quick call and then handed it back to me. While he was on the phone, I noticed his car had several large dents and scratches, which seemed odd given the minor collision we had just had. He also seemed unusually persistent about getting my contact information, asking for more details than necessary. I tried to remain polite but was increasingly uncomfortable. My phone buzzed with a notification, and I checked it to see a message from an unknown number. The message was as simple: "You're next." Panic set in. I looked around, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The man had now moved back to his car and was fiddling with something in the trunk. I took a step back and tried to call the police, but my phone was acting up, and I couldn't get a signal. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise from the woods nearby. It sounded like footsteps. My heart pounded as I saw figures emerging from the shadows. They were moving towards us, their intentions unclear but clearly threatening. I knew I had to act quickly. I turned to the man, who was now watching the approaching figures with a grim expression. "What's going on?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he rushed towards me, grabbing my arm. "We need to go," he said urgently. His previous facade of concern was gone. He was now forceful and desperate. I resisted, pulling away. "I'm calling the police," I shouted. I tried to dial again, but my phone was dead. The figures in the woods were getting closer, and I could see they were carrying flashlights and large bags. Realizing I was running out of time, I decided to make a break for it. I sprinted towards the road, hoping to flag down any passing vehicle. The man tried to chase after me, but I managed to stay ahead. My adrenaline was pumping, and I could hear the figures from the woods closing in. I finally saw headlights in the distance and ran towards them, waving my arms frantically. The car stopped, and I ran up to the driver, who looked alarmed. I quickly explained what had happened and asked for help. The driver, a kind woman, let me into her car and immediately called the police. We waited anxiously as the sirens grew closer. The man and the figures from the woods never showed up again. When the police arrived, I gave them a detailed account of everything that had happened. They took the incident very seriously and went to investigate the area where I had seen the figures. I later learned that they found evidence of a larger scheme involving staged accidents and robbery attempts. I was shaken but relieved when the police assured me I was safe. They informed me that the man who had hit me and the others involved had been part of a criminal ring targeting unsuspecting drivers. They thanked me for providing crucial information that helped them crack the case. I was working late on a film project for class, editing footage in my dorm room. The room was dimly lit by the desk lamp, and the outside was pitch black. I was focused on getting the final cut done before the deadline. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I did, there was Chris, a fellow student from my film class, standing there with a friendly smile. He'd always seemed a bit intense, but he had a reputation for being passionate about his work. "Hey, Alex," he said. "I noticed you're working on your project. Mind if I come in and take a look?" I was a bit taken aback. I didn't know Chris well, and I was in the middle of editing, but he seemed genuinely interested. I reluctantly agreed, and he walked in and took a seat at my desk. At first, things were fine. Chris offered some suggestions and pointed out a few things that might improve my film. I was grateful for the feedback, though his suggestions seemed a bit pushy. Still, I wanted to be polite, so I listened and made a few changes. The more time went on, the more Chris started taking over. He insisted on handling the editing himself to speed things up. I was uneasy but didn't want to cause a scene. I let him work while I tried to stay out of his way. Around midnight, Chris's demeanor shifted. He became more demanding and started questioning my decisions about the film. "Are you sure you want to use that scene?" he asked sharply. "It's not very impactful." I tried to explain why I chose it, but he brushed me off. "I know what works," he said. "Trust me, I've done this before." He began redoing parts of the project without asking. It was clear he was pushing boundaries, and I started feeling uncomfortable. I attempted to take back control, but Chris became aggressive. "You don't understand the importance of this," he shouted. His tone was harsh, and his eyes were wide. Let me help you, or you'll ruin your film. I was taken aback by his sudden aggression. I appreciate your help, but I need to finish this on my own, I said firmly. I was starting to get scared. This was not the behavior I expected from someone I barely knew. Chris didn't take it well. He slammed his hand on the desk and leaned in close. You don't get it, do you? I'm trying to help you, and you're making a mistake. His voice was low and threatening. I tried to stay calm, backing away slightly. I need you to leave now, I said, trying to sound assertive. Chris's expression hardened. You think you can just kick me out after I've put in all this effort, he growled. He stood up, blocking the exit. I'm not going anywhere until you understand what I'm trying to do for you. My heart was racing. I glanced around the room, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. I needed to get him out and lock the door. I was starting to panic. I decided to make a move. I quickly grabbed my phone and pretended to call campus security, hoping the sound of ringing would make him back off. I'm calling for help, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Chris's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed unsure. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with anger. But this isn't over. He shoved past me and stormed out of the room. I locked the door behind him and immediately called campus security for real. I explained what had happened, and they promised to send someone over. I sat by the door, my hands trembling, until they arrived. When the security officers came, I explained everything in detail. They took my statement and checked the footage from the building's security cameras to see if Chris had done anything suspicious outside my room. They assured me they would keep an eye on him and advised me to report any further incidents. The next day, I spoke to my professor about the situation. She was supportive and advised me to stay safe and avoid being alone with Chris if possible. She also promised to address the issue with the film department. I later found out that Chris had a history of aggressive behavior, which was concerning. The authorities took the situation seriously, and Chris was warned about his conduct. He eventually stopped bothering me, and I was able to finish my project in peace. I had an interview scheduled for a part-time job I'd found online. It sounded like a great opportunity, a flexible position with good pay. The job listing was well written, and the company seemed legitimate. The interview was set for 8 p.m., which was a bit unusual, but I didn't think much of it. I arrived at the office building a bit early, hoping to have a few minutes to calm my nerves. The building was old and a bit run down, but it looked like it was still in use. The lobby was dark and quiet, with only a faint flicker of lights. I went to the reception desk, but there was no one there. I waited for a few minutes before someone finally arrived, a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson. He didn't wear a suit or anything formal. His clothes were casual, almost like he was on his day off. Sorry for the wait, he said with a friendly smile. Let's head up to my office. He led me to a small, dimly lit office on the top floor. The space was cluttered with papers and old furniture. I noticed there were no other offices or people around. It felt isolated, but I tried to stay positive. Mr. Thompson offered me a seat across from his desk. He started asking typical interview questions, but there was something off about the way he was speaking. He kept insisting on details about my personal life, things I wouldn't normally share in a job interview. I answered cautiously, trying to maintain professionalism. As the interview progressed, Mr. Thompson began to shift the conversation away from my qualifications and more towards my financial situation. So, how are you handling your student loans? He asked, leaning forward with an intense look in his eyes. Any credit issues we should know about? I felt uncomfortable. I'm managing fine, I said. But I'd rather not discuss my finances in detail. He seemed unfazed. I understand, but it's important for us to know our candidates' backgrounds. We like to ensure everyone is in a good position financially. It's part of our screening process. His insistence made me uneasy. I tried to redirect the conversation back to the job role, but he continued to push for personal details. Have you ever been involved in any legal issues? Sometimes it's relevant to our work. The questions grew more intrusive. He wanted to know about past addresses, my family's financial situation, and even details about my social media accounts. I began to feel trapped. Something about the situation felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Then Mr. Thompson made a strange offer. We're looking for someone who can help us with some sensitive projects. It involves working with confidential information, but it pays well. Are you interested? I hesitated. What kind of projects? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, just some tasks that require discretion. Nothing illegal, just very private. You'd be well compensated. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. I politely declined the offer and said I wasn't comfortable with the terms. Mr. Thompson's demeanor changed immediately. His smile vanished, and he grew serious. Are you sure? We really could use someone like you. And you've already shared a lot of personal information. It would be a shame to waste that. I stood up, my heart racing. I think I'm done here. Thank you for your time. As I turned to leave, Mr. Thompson followed me to the door. He tried to maintain a friendly tone, but his words had a threatening edge. If you change your mind, you have our contact details. We wouldn't want to see you struggling. I hurried out of the office, my mind racing. I could feel his eyes on my back as I left the building. I quickly walked to my car and drove away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Once I was safely home, I realized how close I had come to something dangerous. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, explaining the situation and providing them with the details of the office and Mr. Thompson's contact information. They took the matter seriously and said they would look into it. I also reported the job listing and interview to the job board website. They removed the listing and assured me they would investigate. I made sure to monitor my credit reports and accounts closely for any suspicious activity. The experience left me shaken and cautious about job searches. It taught me to trust my instincts and be wary of situations that seem off, especially when dealing with personal information. I was relieved to have avoided a potentially dangerous situation, and it made me more vigilant about protecting my privacy. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend getaway for months. I found this charming cabin online, nestled in the woods, far from the city. The reviews were positive, and the photos looked perfect. I was ready to unwind, disconnect, and enjoy some peace. I drove up late Friday evening, eager to get to the cabin before dark. The road leading to the place was narrow and winding. Trees loomed on either side, and the sun had already set, leaving only moonlight to guide me. The cabin was supposed to be secluded, and as I drove up the driveway, I noticed how isolated it was. A bit eerie, but I brushed it off as part of the charm. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures, rustic and cozy. I pulled up and unloaded my bags, admiring the quiet of the night. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. I fumbled with the lockbox to retrieve the key. After a few moments, I finally managed to get the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was exactly as I had hoped, with a warm fireplace and comfy furniture. I was about to settle in when I noticed something odd, a faint red light flashing from behind a painting on the wall. Curious, I moved the painting aside and found a small camera hidden behind it. I was taken aback. I checked another spot in the room and found another camera tucked away in a corner. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I started looking around more frantically and discovered cameras in every room, behind mirrors, in vents, and even under the furniture. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to monitor the cabin. My heart raced as I realized that my privacy had been completely violated. I tried to stay calm and think through my options. I considered leaving right away, but I had driven hours to get there, and the road back was pitch dark. I decided to call the rental company to see if they knew anything about this. I dialed the number listed in the email confirmation but got no response. I left a message, hoping someone would get back to me soon. As I was about to head outside to check if there were any more cameras, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Hello, Ben. I see you found our little surprise," a male voice said, sounding calm but menacing. "I hope you're comfortable." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who is this? Why are there cameras in the cabin? The voice laughed, a cold, unsettling sound. "Let's just say we're very interested in you and your stay. We're going to make sure it's worth our while." I tried to stay composed. "What do you want?" The voice grew more serious. "We have a few requests. You'll find instructions in the cabin. Follow them carefully, or things could get unpleasant." The call ended abruptly. I was left standing in the dim light of the cabin, feeling more frightened than I ever had before. I searched the cabin for any instructions and found a note hidden in a drawer. It instructed me to remain in the cabin and wait for further instructions. It also threatened that if I didn't comply, they would expose my private moments online. Panic set in. I looked around for a way to protect myself. I grabbed my phone and tried to reach out to the local police, but there was no cell service. I felt completely cut off. I was trapped. I decided to take a risk. I went outside to see if I could find a way to alert someone or at least get a better signal. The night was pitch dark, and the woods seemed to close in around me. I used my flashlight to look for any signs of people or nearby houses. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Just as I was about to give up, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran towards them, hoping it was someone who could help. As the vehicle approached, I waved frantically. The car stopped, and a man stepped out. I was relieved to see a local sheriff's deputy. I explained the situation to him, and he immediately took action. He contacted his office and arranged for backup. The deputy accompanied me back to the cabin, where he inspected the setup. The police took the situation seriously. They found hidden cameras, recording equipment, and even a laptop with live feeds. It became clear that someone had been watching me and intended to exploit the situation. They quickly began an investigation and traced the number I had received to a local criminal operation. The authorities assured me they would handle it and that I was no longer in immediate danger. I decided to cut my trip short and left the cabin with the deputy. They provided me with a safe place to stay until the situation was resolved. I returned home feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. The experience was unsettling, and I had to deal with the fallout of the invasion of privacy. It took some time to get over the shock and to feel comfortable in my own space again. I'm sharing this story to remind others to always be cautious and to trust their instincts. I had been working as a delivery driver for a few months, mainly handling evening shifts. The job was usually straightforward: pick up, drop off, and get paid. Most of the time, I didn't think much about the addresses I visited. But one night, things took a turn for the worse. It was a particularly quiet evening. I was finishing up my shift when I got a late delivery request. The address was in a secluded area I hadn't been to before. I checked the details on my app, and everything seemed normal: just a late delivery, no special instructions. I accepted the job, figuring it would be a simple drop-off. I drove for about 45 minutes, following the directions my GPS gave me. The road narrowed, and the trees seemed to press in closer on either side. It was dark, and the only light was from my headlights. The address took me to a long driveway leading up to a house that was barely visible from the road. I hesitated for a moment, but then I reminded myself it was just another delivery. When I finally reached the house, I saw that it was an old, run-down place. The porch light flickered weakly, casting strange shadows. I approached the door with the package and rang the bell. There was no immediate response. I waited, feeling uneasy as the silence stretched on. Finally, the door creaked open. A man appeared in the doorway. He looked disheveled, with unkempt hair and a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say anything right away. He just stared at me, making me uncomfortable. "Delivery for this address," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I held out the package. The man took a long look at me before stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated but followed him inside, mainly because I didn't want to seem rude. The interior of the house was just as unsettling as the outside. Dim light came from a single lamp in the corner, barely illuminating the room. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs, and there was a musty smell in the air. The man took the package and set it on a table. He turned to me and said, "I need you to do something for me." I didn't like the way he was looking at me. "I'm just here to drop this off," I replied. He ignored me and continued, "I need you to stay here for a little while." My heart started to race. I really can't stay. I have other deliveries to make. The man's demeanor changed. He became more forceful. "I'm not asking. You need to stay here." I felt a cold sweat break out. "Why? What's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a nearby closet and pulled out a large, old-fashioned looking key. He handed it to me. "Here's the key to the back door. Don't leave." I was terrified. My mind raced with thoughts of how to get out of there. "Look, I really need to go. This isn't right." The man's face hardened. "I'm not giving you a choice. You're staying." He moved closer, and I could see the anger in his eyes. I realized he was serious. I backed up towards the door, but he blocked my way. As I tried to think of an escape, I heard a noise coming from upstairs, a shuffling sound, like someone walking around. My fear escalated. I managed to get a glimpse of the stairs leading up to the second floor. The man noticed my glance and said, "Don't worry about them. They're not involved in this." I had no idea who or what was up there, but the situation was clearly getting worse. I tried to reason with him again. "Please, just let me go. I don't want any trouble." He moved closer, and I could feel his breath on my face. "I told you not to leave. If you try to leave, things will go badly for you." I was desperate. I spotted a small window near the door and made a split-second decision. I grabbed the key from the man's hand, took a deep breath, and made a run for the window. I fumbled with the lock and managed to open it. I climbed out of the window, despite the sharp edges and the tight squeeze. I landed in the overgrown bushes outside, scraping my hands and knees. I could hear the man shouting behind me as I ran. I dashed down the driveway, my heart pounding. I made it to my car, jumped inside, and sped away. The darkness and the shadows of the trees felt oppressive, but I didn't stop until I was back on the main road. Shaking and scared, I drove straight to the nearest police station. I reported the incident, giving them the address and as many details as I could remember. The officers took it seriously and said they would investigate. I was advised to stay away from that area and to keep my phone on me at all times. The entire experience left me rattled. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had stayed longer or if I had been less alert. I had been working late at the office and decided to take the bus home instead of waiting for a cab. I was tired and just wanted to get home. It was around midnight, and the bus was almost empty when I got on. I found a seat near the back and settled in, hoping for a quiet ride. A few stops later, a man boarded the bus. He was rough around the edges, with a disheveled appearance and a tattered jacket. I didn't think much of it at first. He sat a few rows ahead of me and kept glancing back in my direction. It made me uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it and focus on my phone. The bus ride continued, and the man's glances became more frequent. I noticed him moving closer to where I was sitting. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. The man finally stood up and walked towards me, his movements unsteady. He stopped right next to my seat and stared at me with a look that made my skin crawl. "Hey," he said, his voice low and gruff. "You got any money on you?" I tried to stay calm and said, "No, I don't. I don't have any cash." I hoped that if I avoided eye contact and kept my response short, he'd leave me alone. He didn't move. "I know you got something. Don't lie to me." My heart began to race. I glanced around, but the bus was still mostly empty. "I really don't have anything," I said, my voice trembling a little. The man's expression turned darker. "You think you can just ignore me?" "I don't like being ignored." He leaned in closer, and I could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath. I felt trapped. I tried to get up from my seat, but he blocked my way. "Just leave me alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't listen. Instead, he grabbed my arm with a vice-like grip. I winced in pain and tried to pull away, but he held on. "You're coming with me," he said. "I know you got something valuable." At this point, I was panicking. I glanced at the bus driver, hoping he would notice what was happening, but the driver seemed absorbed in whatever was on his dashboard. I realized the bus was now moving through a rough part of town, where the streetlights were sparse, and the area looked even more desolate. The man continued to hold my arm, his grip tightening. "You're not getting away. I don't want to hurt you, but you're making it hard on yourself." I needed to think fast. I tried to calm myself down and come up with a plan. I noticed the emergency exit near the back of the bus. If I could get to it, maybe I could escape. I decided to try and make a break for it. I took a deep breath and, with a sudden burst of strength, I yanked my arm away from his grip. I darted towards the emergency exit. The man was right behind me, shouting and cursing. I could hear his footsteps growing louder, closing in on me. As I reached the exit, I pulled the lever, and the door swung open. I jumped out, landing hard on the pavement. The man followed, but by then, I was already running. I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted down the street, hoping to find somewhere safe. I saw a dimly lit convenience store ahead and ran inside. The cashier looked at me with concern as I stumbled through the door, out of breath and terrified. I told him what had happened and asked to use the phone. I called the police and waited at the store until they arrived. When the officers came, I gave them all the details I could remember about the man in the bus. They promised to investigate and keep an eye out for the suspect. Eventually, they offered me a ride home. I was grateful to be out of that terrifying situation, but I couldn't shake the feeling of fear and helplessness. The high school reunion was supposed to be a pleasant walk down memory lane, a chance to catch up with old friends and reminisce about the past. I hadn't seen most of my classmates in years, and the idea of reconnecting was exciting. The event was held at a hotel on the outskirts of town, a fancy ballroom decked out with twinkling lights and a buffet table. I arrived a little late and went straight to the bar for a drink. I didn't know many people there right away, so I started mingling with a few familiar faces. Everything seemed normal until I noticed him, Mark. He had been a classmate of mine back in high school. He looked almost the same, but there was something different about him. At first, he seemed pleasant enough, coming up to me with a smile and asking how I had been. We exchanged small talk, but as the night went on, his demeanor changed. He began to linger around me, following me from one group to another. His questions started to feel a bit too personal, and he seemed overly interested in every detail I shared. I excused myself to use the restroom, hoping to escape the awkwardness. When I came back, Mark was waiting for me. His smile was gone, replaced by an intense look I couldn't quite place. He told me he wanted to talk in private and suggested we step outside for a moment. I was hesitant but agreed, thinking maybe he just wanted to catch up on old times. Once outside, the night air was cool and quiet. Mark's behavior grew increasingly unsettling. He began talking about how much he missed the old days and how he had always admired me. His words were flattering at first, but they soon took a darker turn. He said things like, "I've always thought we were meant to be together, and I've missed you so much." I tried to steer the conversation back to more neutral topics, but he wouldn't let up. He started talking about how he had been following my life from afar, keeping track of what I had been doing since high school. His words made my skin crawl. I began to feel trapped, and I looked around for a way to get back inside the hotel. When I tried to excuse myself, Mark grabbed my arm. His grip was firm and unyielding. I asked him to let go, but he just stared at me with a look of frustration and anger. He started to raise his voice, making threats about what would happen if I tried to leave. I felt a surge of fear and realized I had to get out of there immediately. I managed to pull my arm free and told him I needed to go back inside to find my friends. Mark's face twisted with anger, and he said, "You can't just leave. Not after everything." He began following me, and I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the hotel entrance and tried to get back inside, but Mark was right behind me. I slipped past the door as it closed behind me, taking deep breaths and looking around for anyone who might help. I spotted a few people I knew and walked quickly over to them, trying to act normal despite the terror I felt. I told my friends about Mark and how he had been behaving. They were concerned and suggested we contact security. I felt a wave of relief as they approached the hotel staff and explained the situation. Security was quick to act. They went outside to talk to Mark and asked him to leave. I stayed inside with my friends, not daring to go outside again. After a while, one of the security guards came back in to reassure us that Mark had been removed from the property. They said he would not be allowed back in. I felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. The rest of the night was a blur of strained conversations and nervous glances. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting Mark to show up again. When the event finally ended, I left with my friends, making sure to stay in a group and avoid the dark parking lot. The drive home was long and quiet. I kept replaying the night in my mind, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. When I got home, I double-checked that all the doors were locked and tried to calm myself down. It took a while before I could sleep. The memory of Mark's face and his unsettling words stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. The idea was to get away from the hustle and bustle, enjoy some peace and quiet, and spend quality time with the family. I thought it would be perfect for a relaxing break. The cabin was nestled in the woods, about a half-hour drive from the nearest town. It looked charming enough in the pictures, rustic, but with all the basic amenities. We arrived late in the afternoon. The drive up the winding road was uneventful, but there was something unsettling about the way the trees seemed to close in around us. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest. It looked exactly like the brochure promised, and at first, everything seemed fine. We unloaded the car, got settled in, and then went for a quick walk around the property. That evening, as we were having dinner, we noticed a few things. The cabin was much quieter than we expected. There were no crickets or owls, just an eerie silence. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured maybe it was just the time of year or the fact that we were so deep in the woods. Later that night, we heard some noises outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching on the gravel road. I went to check, but saw nothing. I thought maybe it was just animals or someone else staying in the area. I didn't see any other cabins nearby, but it wasn't out of the question that someone could be walking by. The next morning, I noticed that one of the outdoor chairs was out of place. I hadn't moved it, and neither had my family. I brushed it off as something that might have happened during the night, maybe due to wind. Still, it made me uneasy. Things started to get stranger after that. Over the next couple of days, we started seeing people around the area, though they were never close enough to get a good look. They seemed to be watching us. Whenever we tried to get a closer look, they would disappear into the woods. I even saw a figure peeking out from behind a tree one afternoon, but when I went to investigate, there was no one there. I tried to keep it from the family to avoid worrying them, but it was getting harder. My wife noticed that there were more cars parked along the road whenever we went out, though we never saw anyone getting out of them. The kids were scared too. They mentioned hearing strange noises at night and seeing shadows moving outside their windows. One night, we had a power outage. I went outside to check the fuse box, and that's when I saw them. There were two men standing by the edge of the property, barely visible in the dark. They were whispering to each other, and one of them was holding something that glinted in the moonlight. I tried to call out to them, but they quickly vanished into the trees. I decided to call the local police, but when I tried, there was no signal. I thought maybe it was just a temporary issue, but it lasted for days. I felt completely cut off from the outside world. The isolation was becoming more oppressive by the hour. By the third night, things escalated. We heard loud banging on the cabin's doors and windows. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, but there was no one there. The kids were crying, and my wife was visibly shaken. I told everyone to stay inside and lock the doors. I was starting to feel like we were being targeted, but I couldn't figure out why or by whom. The next day, I went to the nearest town to find help. I drove the winding road with a growing sense of dread. When I reached the small town, I found that the local police station was closed. I spoke to a gas station attendant who seemed nervous when I mentioned the cabin. He mumbled something about keeping to themselves and told me to be careful. I returned to the cabin, determined to get to the bottom of it. When I got back, everything seemed eerily calm. The chairs were in their places, the power was back on, and the strange figures were gone. I thought maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but I wasn't convinced. That night, the tension was unbearable. I stayed awake, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. I saw more shadows moving outside, and heard faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. Around midnight, I saw headlights through the trees. They moved closer to the cabin, then stopped. I woke my wife and told her we needed to leave. We packed as quickly as we could and left in the dead of night. I drove like a maniac, not stopping until we reached the nearest town with a police station that was actually open. I reported everything that had happened, and the officers promised to send someone to check the cabin, but I didn't stick around to see what would happen. It was a normal Friday night at the restaurant where I worked as a manager. Jenna's had always been a cozy spot, known for its good food and relaxed atmosphere. The place was busy as usual. We had a full house and were bustling with activity. It was a bit chaotic, but that was just a part of the job. Around 9 p.m., a group of 4 people walked in. They were a bit more scruffy than our usual clientele, but I didn't think much of it. The group consisted of 3 men and 1 woman. They seemed to be in their late 20s or early 30s, and their clothes were a little worn out. They took a table in the corner, which gave me a clear view of them from the kitchen. They ordered a couple of drinks and seemed to be having a good time. Nothing out of the ordinary at first. I was busy making sure everyone else was taken care of, but I kept an eye on them. As the night went on, they started acting a bit strange. They kept glancing around and whispering to each other. I noticed they seemed more interested in the layout of the restaurant and where the exits were. At about 10 p.m., I started getting a strange feeling. The way they were looking around made me uneasy. I thought it might be paranoia or just a bad feeling, but I couldn't shake it off. I decided to keep an eye on them more closely. Around 10:30, the woman from the group went to the restroom, and one of the men got up and started walking around the restaurant. He was acting oddly, like he was trying to see where things were kept. I thought maybe he was just a bit drunk and lost, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I went over to the group to check in, and they were friendly enough. They chatted for a bit, and everything seemed normal. I returned to the kitchen, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. It wasn't until 11 p.m. that things took a turn for the worse. The man who had been walking around suddenly stood up, and the group's demeanor changed drastically. They moved quickly and quietly, and I realized they were starting to take action. One of the men went to the restroom and came out with a gun. I could see the gun from the kitchen window, and my heart started racing. I knew I had to act fast. I ran to the office and grabbed my phone, but as soon as I tried to dial 911, the line was cut. Someone had clearly been working to ensure no one could call for help. I took a deep breath and knew I had to keep calm. I grabbed the restaurant's emergency alarm system and activated it. The loud alarm went off, which would hopefully alert anyone nearby that something was wrong. As the alarm blared, the group started to panic. They weren't expecting this level of resistance. The men who had guns began shouting orders. They demanded that everyone in the restaurant stay calm and keep their heads down. The woman started moving toward the office. It was clear they were trying to take control of the entire restaurant. I quickly moved to the back room where the employees were. I told them to stay quiet and stay hidden. I told them to lock the doors and not to come out until I said it was safe. I didn't know what else to do, but I needed to protect them. I watched through the small window in the office door. The woman was trying to break into the office, but the alarm seemed to have been rattled. The men were yelling at each other, and their plans were falling apart. I used the opportunity to find another way out. I found the emergency exit that led to the back alley. I slipped out quietly and ran to the nearest business to get help. I could hear the distant sound of sirens, and it gave me hope. I called 911 as soon as I reached a safe location. The police arrived within minutes, and by the time they got there, the robbers had fled. They had taken some cash and a few valuables, but no one was seriously injured. The police managed to gather evidence and statements from everyone. The robbers were never caught, but I felt a deep sense of relief knowing that everyone had made it out safely. It was a terrifying experience, and I still think about it sometimes. We had to make a lot of changes in the restaurant after that night: better security, more training for staff. But the most important thing was that everyone went home unarmed. I was thankful for the quick actions of my staff and the timely arrival of the police. It was a night I hope never to experience again. It was around 9 p.m. when I noticed something odd. I was just finishing up dinner when I saw the mailman, Carl, outside. Normally, he'd deliver the mail and leave quickly, but tonight he was lingering. It was late for mail delivery, and he seemed to be watching my house. I brushed it off at first, thinking I was just being paranoid. Over the next few days, I started noticing Carl's behavior was even stranger. He would show up at odd hours, even after his shift was over. I saw him loitering around my street and peeking through my windows. At first, I thought maybe he was having personal issues or something, but it kept escalating. One evening, I saw him standing on my driveway, staring up at my window. I called out to him from inside, but he quickly walked away. This wasn't right. I decided to check if anything was missing or if there were any signs of tampering around the house. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. A week later, things took a darker turn. I came home from work and found a note in my mailbox, written on a plain piece of paper. It read, "I see you. Why don't you want to talk to me?" My heart sank when I read it. I knew then that something was seriously wrong. I contacted the police to report the strange behavior. They took my report seriously, but they couldn't do much without solid evidence. They told me to keep an eye out and make sure to lock up properly. They said they'd check into it, but I couldn't expect immediate action. I started taking extra precautions. I locked all the doors and windows and set up a camera system around the house. I even made sure to park my car in the garage instead of the driveway. The last thing I wanted was to be caught off guard. One night, I saw Carl parked across the street. He was in his mail truck, just sitting there, staring at my house. I felt a rush of fear but tried to stay calm. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he had left. They assured me they were keeping an eye out for him, but it was clear they couldn't do much without catching him in the act. The next few nights, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. I would check the cameras constantly, looking for any sign of Carl. My paranoia reached a peak. I started getting nervous even during the day, fearing that Carl might find a way to get into my house. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside my bedroom window. I looked at the camera feed and saw Carl trying to open the window. My heart raced. I didn't know what to do. I called the police immediately, but I knew they wouldn't arrive in time to catch him. I grabbed my phone and hid in the closet. I could hear Carl trying to break the window. It sounded like he was using some sort of tool. I texted the police, telling them the situation was urgent. I could hear him getting frustrated and pounding on the window. Finally, I heard sirens approaching. Carl bolted from the window and ran, but not before the police saw him fleeing the scene. They chased him, and after a brief pursuit, they managed to catch him. I was shaken, but relieved that they finally apprehended him. The police searched his mail truck and found tools that could be used for breaking and entering, along with some disturbing items like photos of my house and personal notes. They charged him with stalking and attempted burglary. After that night, I felt a mix of relief and fear. The sense of security I once had was shattered, but I was grateful that I was safe. I took additional steps to improve my home security and worked on regaining my sense of normalcy. The whole ordeal left me anxious, and I was more vigilant than ever. But at least I could sleep at night knowing that Carl was no longer a threat. It was a terrifying experience, but I managed to get through it with the help of the police and the safety measures I put in place. It started around midnight. I was just about to turn in when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized. I figured it was probably a wrong number or some late-night telemarketer, so I let it go to voicemail. The call came again, a few minutes later. I answered this time, thinking I might as well see what it was about. "Hello?" I said. There was no response. I waited for a moment, but all I could hear was heavy breathing. I hung up, thinking it was a prank. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, it was a recorded voice, distorted and hard to understand. It said something about compliance and payment. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. I was starting to feel uneasy. I didn't have any idea what this was about or who could be behind it. I considered reporting it to the police, but decided to wait and see if it was just a one-off. The calls kept coming. Each time, the voice was more aggressive, demanding something I couldn't quite understand. One night, the caller said, "We know where you live. You need to cooperate." My heart was racing. I was home alone, and the thought of someone watching me was terrifying. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The calls were relentless, always late at night. The voice became more threatening, making bizarre demands that made no sense. One night, it said, "If you don't pay us what we're asking for, things will get bad." I didn't have a clue what they wanted. I didn't owe anyone money. I tried to keep my composure and not let it show that I was scared. But it was hard. I started keeping my phone on silent and only checking it occasionally. One evening, I received a call that was different. The voice said, "You have until tomorrow. After that, we'll come to collect." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I called the police, but without specific threats or any indication of who the caller was, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the threats and wondering if someone was actually watching me. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Every little noise made me jump. The following night, I received another call. The voice was clearer this time, almost as if it was trying to be more personal. "We're not playing games. If you don't act, there will be consequences." I felt a mix of fear and anger. Who were these people? What did they want from me? I started to think they might be trying to intimidate me into doing something. I considered changing my phone number and moving, but it seemed extreme. I didn't want to give in to their demands without knowing what they wanted. The calls kept coming. Every night, they became more intense, more threatening. The last call I received was the worst. The voice said, "Tonight is your final chance. We will be watching you." I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police again, explaining the entire situation in detail. They sent an officer to check my house. I showed him the call logs and told him about the threats. The officer was sympathetic but said they'd need more evidence to take action. He advised me to stay alert and keep the police informed of any new developments. That night, I stayed up, sitting near the front door with my phone in hand. I watched the clock, waiting for any sign of trouble. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise outside. My heart pounded. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. I tried to calm myself, thinking it might be a raccoon or some other animal. Then I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer to my door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but my hands were shaking. I could barely speak. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I heard someone trying to turn the handle, but it was locked. Just then, I heard sirens in the distance. The footsteps outside stopped, and I could hear someone running away. The police arrived quickly, but by then, the intruder was gone. They checked the perimeter of the house but found no sign of forced entry or anything unusual. The police continued their investigation and kept a closer watch on the area for a while. The threatening calls eventually stopped, and I didn't receive any more strange messages. It was a relief, but the experience left me feeling uneasy and hyper-aware of my surroundings. I decided to change my phone number and install additional security measures at home. I also reached out to a counselor to help deal with the lingering anxiety. I'd never imagined a simple delivery could turn into such a nightmare. It was a Friday night, and I was just winding down after a long week at work. I was about to call it a night when I received a notification on my phone. It was for a delivery request from a local restaurant. They wanted to confirm my address for a large order. I hadn't placed any order, but I thought maybe it was a mistake or a mix-up with another customer. I tried calling the number listed in the message, but it went straight to voicemail. I was about to ignore it when I got another call from a different number. It was a man's voice on the line, and he claimed to be the delivery driver. He said he was on his way and would be there in about 30 minutes. I was annoyed but figured I'd let it slide. Maybe someone had ordered food and put in the wrong address. When the delivery arrived, it was nearly 10 p.m. I was just about to go to bed, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find a man standing there with a large bag of food. He looked to be in his late 30s, average build, wearing a restaurant uniform and a hat. "Hey there," he said, barely making eye contact. "I need cash for this order." I was taken aback. Cash? I didn't order this. I didn't even place an order. He didn't seem to care. He just stood there, staring at me. "Look, I need the cash. This is a big order. The restaurant won't take it back." I told him again that I hadn't ordered anything and that I wasn't going to pay for it. He grew more insistent, his voice rising slightly. "I don't care if you didn't order it. You're paying for it now. Or else." I could feel my anxiety building. I told him I wasn't going to pay and started to close the door. That's when he pushed his way inside. I was shocked. He forced the door open and stepped into my hallway, still holding the bag of food. His demeanor changed from annoyed to outright hostile. "Listen, you're going to pay for this. You have no choice," he said, his voice now threatening. "This is a scam. We know people like you will fall for it." I tried to back away, but he blocked my path. "What do you mean, a scam? Get out of my house." He laughed, a cold and unsettling sound. You think you can just refuse? We have your address. We know where you live. I felt my heart racing. My mind was racing, too, trying to figure out what to do. I had to get out of this situation. I decided to try and reason with him again. I offered to call the police, but he just scoffed. Go ahead, he said. But by the time they get here, it'll be too late. You think this is just about money? We're not leaving until we get what we want. I was terrified. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but he snatched it from my hand and threw it against the wall. The phone shattered, and I felt a wave of panic. I didn't know what to do next. I started thinking about ways to get away from him. I tried to stay calm and look for an opening. I remembered I had a security system, so I went for the keypad to set off the alarm. I hoped the noise would scare him off or at least draw attention from neighbors. He noticed what I was doing and grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. Don't even think about it, he growled. We're not leaving until we get something. I managed to pull away and threw the door open, hoping someone outside would see what was happening. I screamed for help, praying someone would hear me. I could hear the delivery man shouting threats as he tried to drag me back inside. Fortunately, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw headlights pulling up to my house. It was a police car. The delivery man noticed them too and started backing away. He quickly dropped the bag and bolted for his car, which was parked on the street. I could see him scrambling to get away as the police got out of their vehicle. The officers came inside, and I explained everything as best as I could. They took a statement and went out to search for the man, but he was already long gone. They advised me to be careful and to keep an eye out for any more suspicious activity. I was shaken but relieved that the nightmare was over. The police assured me that they'd keep an eye out for any similar scams in the area. I had to replace my broken phone and repair the door, but I was grateful to be safe. I learned an important lesson that night. Always double-check unexpected deliveries and never let your guard down, no matter how routine things might seem. I had always loved the ocean, its vastness, the rhythm of the waves, the sense of freedom it gave me. So, when I discovered the secluded beach, I thought I had found my personal paradise. The beach was hidden away, accessible only by a narrow, winding path through dense forest. It was perfect, quiet, untouched, and, best of all, far from the crowds. That evening, I decided to head out for a sunset surf. The waves looked perfect, and I wanted to make the most of the last light of the day. I grabbed my board and made my way to the water. The surf was incredible. The waves were just right, and I lost myself in the thrill of riding them. Time seemed to stand still as I caught wave after wave. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A group of men had appeared on the beach, standing in a loose circle. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just locals or other surfers who had found the same secluded spot. But as I paddled back out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The men weren't dressed for the beach. They wore dark clothing, and their stances were tense, their gazes fixed on me. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the waves, but the unease grew. I decided to catch one last wave and head back. As I rode it in, I could see the men more clearly. There were 4 of them, all watching me intently, their expressions unreadable. When I reached the shore, I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The men didn't move, just stood there, blocking the path back to my car. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my chest. I forced a casual smile and nodded at them as I walked up the beach, my board under my arm. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't respond, just continued to watch me. I kept walking, hoping they would move or lose interest. But as I got closer, they stepped forward, forming a loose semicircle around me. "Nice night for a surf," one of them said, his voice low and rough. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Beautiful sunset." My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. They were too close to run, and there was no one else around. "Not many people come here," another man said, his eyes narrowing. "How'd you find this place?" His tone was accusatory, almost threatening. "Just exploring," I said, my throat dry. "I like finding new spots." I took a step back, but they moved with me, closing the gap. I could feel the tension in the air, like a coiled spring ready to snap. "We don't like strangers here," the first man said, his voice hard. "Especially ones who don't know when to leave." The threat was clear, and my fear spiked. "I was just leaving," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll get out of your way." I took another step back, but they advanced, their faces set with grim determination. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The path to my car was blocked, and the ocean was at my back. I was trapped, with no clear way out. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over our spot?" the second man snarled. "Think again." He reached out, grabbing my arm with a bruising grip. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll go." "Just let me go." The men exchanged glances, and then the first one nodded. "Run," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "We'll give you a head start." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the sand. I could hear their laughter behind me, but I didn't look back. My only thought was to get to my car and escape. The path through the forest was narrow and dark, the fading light making it hard to see. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I pushed through, my heart racing. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. They were gaining on me, and I knew I had to think fast. I veered off the path, hoping to lose them in the dense foliage. The forest was thick and disorienting. I stumbled through the undergrowth, trying to stay quiet. My breaths were ragged, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I found a small hollow under a fallen tree and crawled in, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. "Where'd he go?" one of them shouted, frustration evident in his voice. "He can't have gotten far." They spread out, searching the area. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tensed. Minutes felt like hours as they combed the forest. I could hear them calling to each other, their voices angry and impatient. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever, but I had to wait for the right moment. Finally, the footsteps began to fade as they moved further away. I took a chance and crept out of my hiding spot, moving as quietly as possible. I had to get to my car and get out of there. I made my way back to the path, keeping low and listening for any sign of the men. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the distant crash of the waves. When I reached the edge of the forest, I could see my car parked where I had left it. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I sprinted the last few yards, my eyes scanning for any sign of the men. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I could see movement in the trees and knew I had to hurry. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into gear. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, I saw them burst out of the forest, shouting and waving their arms. I didn't look back, my only focus on putting as much distance between us as possible. When I finally reached the main road, I slowed down, my heart still racing. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my mind reeling from the events of the night. The officers took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could tell they were skeptical. A secluded beach, a group of men, it sounded like a bad movie plot. I never went back to that beach. Ever. It was a late Friday night, and I was driving back home from a long week of work. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark, with only the occasional car passing by. I was tired, eager to get home and just collapse into bed. That's when I saw him, standing by the side of the road, his thumb out. A hitchhiker. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about him seemed harmless. He looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in a worn-out jacket and jeans, carrying a small backpack. Maybe he was just down on his luck and needed a ride. I slowed down and pulled over. "Hey there, where are you headed?" I asked as he leaned in through the window. "Just a few miles up the road," he replied with a friendly smile. "If it's not too much trouble." "Hop in," I said, unlocking the door. He climbed in, thanking me. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement. He seemed normal enough, making small talk about the weather and how quiet the roads were at night. After a while, the conversation died down, and he seemed to get more comfortable. He asked if I had a cigarette, and I handed him one from my glove compartment. He lit it, taking a deep drag, and stared out the window. "So, what do you do?" he asked, exhaling smoke. "Just office work," I replied. "Nothing too exciting." He nodded, then there was another long silence. I started to feel uneasy, the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. "You know," he said suddenly, his tone changing, "it's not often people stop for hitchhikers these days. Too many crazies out there." I forced a laugh. "Yeah, I guess so. But you seemed all right." "Seemed," he repeated, a strange smile playing on his lips. My unease grew. There was something off about the way he said that. I glanced at him, and for the first time, noticed how tense he seemed, like he was coiled and ready to spring. "Where did you say you were heading again?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just up ahead," he said vaguely, waving a hand. "I'll tell you when to stop." Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The road was completely deserted now, not a single car in sight. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, his movements becoming more erratic. I kept one eye on the road and one on him, my heart pounding. Suddenly, he lunged, grabbing the steering wheel. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching. I fought to regain control, wresting the wheel from his grip. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. He didn't answer, just kept trying to steer us off the road. I managed to push him back into his seat, but he was strong, his eyes wild and desperate. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, pulling a knife from his jacket. The blade glinted in the dim light from the dashboard. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. We both jolted forward, the seatbelts locking us in place. Before he could react, I unclipped my belt and threw myself at him, trying to wrestle the knife from his hand. We struggled, the confined space making it hard to move. He slashed at me, and I felt a sharp pain as the blade grazed my arm. I gritted my teeth, grabbing his wrist with both hands and slamming it against the door. The knife clattered to the floor. He was stronger than he looked, and he started to get the upper hand, pinning me against the seat. I felt his hands around my throat, squeezing, cutting off my air. I kicked out blindly, my foot connecting with his knee. He yelled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled for the door handle, flinging it open and tumbling out onto the road. I could hear him cursing, the sound of the knife scraping as he picked it up. I got to my feet, the cool night air hitting my face, and started running. I didn't look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way to escape. The road was empty, no lights, no houses, just darkness. Up ahead, I saw a turnoff, a narrow path leading into the woods. I veered off the road, hoping to lose him in the trees. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I pushed through, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I kept running, my legs burning, my heart pounding. The path twisted and turned, the trees closing in around me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I saw a fallen tree up ahead, its massive trunk lying across the path. I scrambled over it, glancing back for the first time. I could see his shadowy figure in the distance, his pace slowing as he looked around, trying to find me. I crouched behind the tree, trying to catch my breath and stay silent. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I watched as he moved closer, the knife glinting in his hand. He stopped just a few feet away, looking around, his breathing heavy. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. He cursed again, kicking at the dirt, and then he started to move away, back towards the road. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then slowly stood up. My legs were shaking, my whole body trembling. I had to get back to the car, had to get out of there. I started making my way back through the woods, moving as quietly as I could. When I finally reached the road, it was empty. My car was still there, the door hanging open. I glanced around, but there was no sign of him. I ran to the car, jumping in and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding down the road. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still trembling. The attendant looked at me with concern as I walked in, probably seeing the cuts and bruises. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, barely able to speak. "I need to call the police." He handed me the phone, and I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. They told me to stay put and wait for an officer to arrive. As I sat there, waiting, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to losing my life. I'd picked up a hitchhiker, trying to do a good deed, and it had almost cost me everything. I knew I'd never forget that night, the terror and the desperation. When the police arrived, they took my statement and promised to look for the man. I thanked them, but I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe again. The sky was clear, a tapestry of stars stretching infinitely above me. I had chosen this secluded spot for its isolation, far from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Setting up camp, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The dense forest surrounding my tent was a comforting barrier, shielding me from the world. The evening was serene, filled with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. I built a small fire, its warmth a welcome companion in the cool night air. After a simple meal, I settled down with a book, the firelight flickering softly around me. The tranquility was intoxicating, a rare moment of pure relaxation. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, the weight of the day pulling me into a deep sleep. The forest was a cradle, lulling me with its gentle whispers. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in the darkness. Something was wrong. I lay still, listening intently. The silence was heavy, oppressive. A rustling sound came from outside the tent. I froze, fear creeping up my spine. Someone or something was out there. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling continued, closer now. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering out. My campsite was dimly lit by the moon, casting long shadows. Then I saw him, a figure hunched over my backpack, rummaging through my things. Panic surged through me. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to scare him off. The figure straightened, turning to face me. His eyes glinted in the moonlight, a predatory gaze locking onto mine. He didn't run, didn't even flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his expression unreadable. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in one hand, a camping knife in the other. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He said nothing, just watched me with an unsettling calmness. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The isolation that had felt so comforting earlier now seemed like a trap. There was no one to hear me scream, no one to help. The man took another step forward, and I brandished the knife. "Stay back," I warned, trying to sound braver than I felt. A smile spread across his face, chilling in its absence of warmth. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my system. "I'm not alone," I lied. "My friends will be back any minute." His smile widened, a grotesque parody of amusement. "No, they won't." He took another step, and I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I lunged at him, the knife aimed at his chest. He dodged easily, his movements fluid and practiced. He grabbed my wrist, twisting it painfully. The knife fell from my grasp, clattering to the ground. He shoved me backward, and I stumbled, falling hard on the forest floor. Pain shot through me, but I scrambled to my feet, ready to fight. He stood over me, a dark silhouette against the night sky. "Why are you doing this?" I gasped, trying to keep my distance. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't decipher, malice, perhaps, or madness. "Because I can," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. He lunged at me, and I barely had time to react. I ducked, rolling to the side. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I needed to get to my car, but it was a mile away, through dense forest. He advanced again, and I threw a handful of dirt in his face, hoping to blind him. He snarled, wiping at his eyes, giving me a precious few seconds. I bolted, running blindly into the woods. Branches slapped at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, his breath coming in harsh, angry gasps. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with effort. The forest was a maze, each tree and rock looking the same. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to keep going. I stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight illuminating a small, abandoned cabin. Desperate, I ran for it, praying the door wasn't locked. I slammed into the door, relief flooding through me as it gave way. I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was dark and musty, filled with decaying furniture. I searched frantically for something to barricade the door. I found an old chair, wedging it under the doorknob. It wouldn't hold for long, but it was all I had. I backed away, searching for another exit. The man pounded on the door, his fury evident. "You can't hide forever," he shouted, the door shuddering under his blows. I spotted a small window on the far wall. It was narrow, but I could squeeze through. I hurried over, prying it open with trembling hands. Just as I was about to climb out, the door gave way, crashing open. I didn't look back, diving through the window and landing hard outside. I ran again, the man's curses fading behind me. My only thought was to get to my car, to escape this nightmare. The forest closed in around me, but I kept going, fueled by sheer terror and the hope of survival. I had been driving through the back roads of Texas, a familiar route I took to avoid the congestion of the main highways. It was late at night, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees lining the road. As I rounded a bend, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror, too close for comfort. I glanced at the clock past midnight and wondered who else would be out here at this hour. At first, I dismissed it as someone in a hurry, but the car stayed unnervingly close. Every turn I made, every acceleration or deceleration, they mirrored. My heart started to race as I realized this wasn't normal behavior. I tried to shake them off by speeding up, but they matched my pace effortlessly. Panic began to set in as I considered my options. The nearest town was still miles away, and the road stretched out endlessly ahead. Then, without warning, the car behind me swerved dangerously close, headlights blinding in my mirrors. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, heart pounding in my chest. It was clear now they were trying to force me off the road. I refused to give in to fear. I focused on my driving, taking sharp turns and sudden accelerations in an attempt to lose them. But they were persistent, almost as if they knew the road as well as I did. As I approached a fork in the road, I made a split-second decision to take the less traveled path. The car followed suit, and my heart sank. There was no doubt now they were chasing me with intent. The adrenaline surged through me as I navigated the twists and turns, trying to keep control of my vehicle while staying ahead of my pursuer. My mind raced with questions. Why me? Who were they? What did they want? I glanced at my phone, debating whether to call the police. But the thought of taking my eyes off the road for even a second was too risky. I had to focus on escaping first. Everything else could wait. The pursuit intensified. The car behind me started to edge closer, attempting to overtake. I gritted my teeth, refusing to let them succeed. It was a terrifying game of cat and mouse, played out on the dark, deserted roads of rural Texas. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I saw a glimmer of hope, a small town coming into view. Lights from the gas station and a diner illuminated the horizon, promising safety. I pushed my car to its limits, desperate to reach the sanctuary of the town. The car behind me matched my speed, still too close for comfort. But as I neared the outskirts, I saw a police cruiser parked outside the diner. Relief flooded through me. I honked my horn frantically, hoping to catch the attention of the officers. The car behind me hesitated for a moment, then abruptly turned and sped away into the night. I pulled into the parking lot of the diner, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline wore off. The officers approached cautiously, asking me to step out of the car. I explained what had happened, barely able to form coherent sentences. They assured me I was safe now and took down my statement. They promised to patrol the area and keep an eye out for any suspicious vehicles matching the description I provided. As I sat inside the diner, nursing a cup of coffee to calm my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Who were those people? What had they wanted with me? The officers returned with news. They hadn't found the car, but they would continue to patrol the area throughout the night. They advised me to stay in town, at least until morning. I heeded their advice, booking a room at a nearby motel. Sleep eluded me that night, Every sound outside the window made me jump. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. The next morning, I drove straight to the nearest police station to follow up on the investigation. They took my report seriously, but without any leads, there was little they could do. I left feeling frustrated and vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every car that followed too closely, every unfamiliar face, my heart would race, my palms would sweat. I started taking alternate routes, avoiding the back roads altogether. Eventually, life returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be. But the experience had left its mark. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I never forgot that night in Texas, the terror of being chased through the darkness by someone with unknown intentions. To this day, I still wonder who they were and what they wanted. Was it a random act of aggression, or was I targeted for some reason? I may never know the answer, but I've learned to trust my instincts and never take safety for granted. I was house sitting for my aunt in a quiet rural area. She had a cozy little place surrounded by fields and woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway for me while she visited her sister. The first couple of days were just that. Peaceful. The third day, I noticed something odd about the house next door. It was an old farmhouse, run down and usually empty. I knew my aunt said no one lived there, but that afternoon, I saw a car parked out front. I thought maybe someone had bought the place and was checking it out. Later that evening, I saw lights on in the house. They were bright, too bright for a house like that. They stayed on all night, and I found it strange. I tried not to think too much about it, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. The next morning, I saw more cars arriving. Men got out and went into the house, carrying large bags and boxes. They looked rough, not the type you'd expect to see moving into a quiet country home. I started to get a bad feeling. As the day went on, I kept an eye on the house. I saw smoke coming from one of the windows. It didn't look like normal smoke from a chimney, more like something was burning inside. I tried to brush it off, but my curiosity got the best of me. That evening, I decided to take a closer look. I walked my dog along the edge of the property, trying to get a better view without being obvious. The men were moving around inside, and I could hear the hum of machinery. I realized they weren't moving in, they were setting something up. I went back to my aunt's house and locked all the doors and windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something illegal was going on next door. I decided to call my aunt and tell her what I had seen. She agreed it sounded suspicious and told me to stay inside and be careful. The next day, I tried to go about my routine, but I was too on edge. I saw more cars coming and going, and the men were always carrying things in and out. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. That night, I heard loud noises coming from the house. It sounded like a fight. I peeked out the window and saw the men arguing in the yard. One of them had a gun. I froze, realizing how dangerous the situation was. I decided to call the police. I explained everything I had seen and heard. They told me to stay inside and keep my doors locked. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I waited anxiously, watching the house next door. The men were still outside, shouting at each other. I saw one of them glance in my direction, and my heart skipped a beat. I quickly moved away from the window. A few minutes later, I heard a car pull up to my aunt's house. I looked out and saw a police cruiser. Relief washed over me. I went to the door to let the officer in. As I opened the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw one of the men from next door standing there. He looked angry. "What did you see?" he demanded, stepping closer. I backed away, trying to stay calm. "I didn't see anything," I lied, but he didn't believe me. The police officer came up the steps and saw what was happening. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his hand on his holster. The man glared at me, then turned and walked away. The officer escorted me back inside and took my statement. He told me they had been investigating the house next door for some time, suspecting it was being used as a drug lab. They thanked me for calling and said they'd take it from there. The police raided the house that night. They arrested the men and confiscated everything inside. It turned out the place was being used to manufacture drugs, just like I had suspected. I stayed at my aunt's house until she returned, but I never felt completely safe again. I kept the doors locked and didn't go outside unless I had to. I was relieved when my aunt finally came home and I could leave. The experience left me shaken. I learned how quickly a peaceful place could become dangerous. I was grateful for the police and that nothing worse had happened. I was babysitting for the Wilsons one Saturday night. They lived in a nice house next to a large park. Their two kids, Jack and Emily, were always well behaved. It was supposed to be an easy job: play with the kids, put them to bed, and wait for their parents to come home. I had no idea how wrong I was. Jack and Emily were already in their pajamas when I arrived. Mr. Wilson gave me the usual rundown. Bedtime is at 8:30. Snacks are in the kitchen. Call if you need anything. Then they left, and it was just me and the kids. We played some games, and then I let them watch a movie while I checked my phone. Everything seemed normal until I noticed Jack kept glancing out the window towards the park. I asked him if something was wrong, but he just shook his head. I didn't think much of it at the time. After dinner, I told Jack and Emily it was time to get ready for bed. They protested a bit but eventually went upstairs. I tucked them in, read them a story, and they fell asleep pretty quickly. I went back downstairs and settled on the couch, ready for a quiet night. Around 9 p.m., I heard a noise coming from outside. It sounded like low voices. I thought maybe it was just people walking through the park, so I ignored it. But the voices got louder. Curious, I went to the window and peeked out. There were 3 men standing near the edge of the park, close to the Wilsons' house. They were talking quietly and pointing towards the house. My heart started pounding. Something felt very wrong. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I needed to secure the house. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. Then I went upstairs to check on the kids. They were still asleep, oblivious to the danger outside. I went back downstairs and peeked out the window again. The men were closer now, almost at the edge of the yard. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. They said they'd send someone over right away. While I waited, I kept an eye on the men. They were now in the yard, moving quietly but quickly towards the house. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I knew I had to do something to protect Jack and Emily. I grabbed a kitchen knife and went back upstairs. I gently woke up Jack and Emily, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to hide," I said. "There are bad men outside." Their eyes widened with fear, but they didn't argue. I led them to the master bedroom and told them to hide in the closet. I stayed by the door, listening for any sounds from downstairs. A few minutes later, I heard a window break. My blood ran cold. I could hear the men talking, their voices getting closer. I held the knife tightly, my hands shaking. I prayed the police would arrive soon. The footsteps came up the stairs, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The men were right outside the bedroom door. I could hear them whispering, discussing their plan. The door creaked open, and I saw the shadow of one of the men. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the area. I stayed hidden behind the door, my heart racing. He moved towards the closet, and I knew I had to act. I lunged at him, the knife in my hand. He turned just in time to see me, and we struggled. I managed to cut his arm, and he screamed in pain. The other men rushed into the room, and I backed away, holding the knife out in front of me. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. The men panicked and ran downstairs. I followed them, keeping my distance. They broke down the back door and fled into the park just as the police arrived. I ran to the front door and opened it for the officers. I told them what happened, my voice shaking. They searched the house and the surrounding area but didn't find the men. They took my statement and assured me they would keep an eye on the neighborhood. I called the Wilsons and explained what happened. They rushed home, terrified and grateful that Jack, Emily, and I were safe. The police stayed until they arrived, making sure everything was secure. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I kept thinking about how easily it could have gone differently. The Wilsons were horrified but grateful. They promised to install better security and be more cautious. I was driving through Wyoming on a road trip, just trying to clear my head. It was getting late, and I was too tired to keep going, so I decided to stop at a small motel just off the highway. The neon sign said vacancy. It looked a bit run down, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to sleep. I walked into the office, and there was a man behind the desk. He looked tired, with bags under his eyes and a cigarette hanging from his lips. He gave me a room key without much conversation. Room 12. I thanked him and walked to my room. The hallways were dimly lit, and everything smelled faintly of mildew. The room was basic: a bed, a small TV, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I threw my bag on the bed and decided to take a quick shower. As the hot water hit my skin, I felt some of the tension from driving all day start to melt away. After my shower, I laid on the bed and flipped through the channels on the TV, trying to find something to watch. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was woken up by a loud banging on my door. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My heart started racing. Who would be knocking on my door at this hour? I got up and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out. "Police," a voice answered. "Open up." Confused and a little scared, I opened the door a crack. 2 men stood there, flashing their badges. They looked rough, like they had been up all night. "We need to talk to you," one of them said. "Can we come in?" I let them in, my mind racing with what they could want. "Is there a problem, officers?" One of them, a tall guy with a scar on his cheek, looked at me with cold eyes. "We got a report that someone fitting your description was seen near the scene of a crime earlier tonight. We need to ask you a few questions." I was taken aback. There must be some mistake. I've been here all night. I just checked in a few hours ago. The other cop, shorter and stockier, looked around my room as if he was expecting to find something. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked, but it didn't sound like a question. I nodded, feeling cornered. They started going through my things, rifling through my bag and checking the bathroom. I stood there, feeling helpless. After a few minutes, they seemed satisfied and turned back to me. "You're not in any trouble," the tall one said. "But we need you to come down to the station and answer a few questions, just to clear things up." I didn't want to go, but what choice did I have? "Okay," I said. "Let me grab my wallet." I reached for my wallet on the nightstand, but as I turned around, I caught a glimpse of the tall cop's face. He had a strange look in his eyes, something that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could react, the shorter one grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back. The tall one pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, struggling against them. "Just a precaution," the tall cop said, but his tone was menacing. They cuffed me and dragged me out of the room, ignoring my protests. They shoved me into the back of their squad car and started driving. My mind was racing. This didn't feel right. They weren't taking me to the station. We were heading out of town, into the dark, empty stretches of road. I tried to stay calm, thinking of a way out. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a little detour," the tall cop said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror with that same cold look. The car finally stopped in a secluded area, far from any lights or buildings. They pulled me out and pushed me to the ground. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I was in serious trouble. "We can't let you go," the tall cop said. "You know too much." "But I don't know anything," I shouted. "You've got the wrong guy." They didn't listen. The shorter cop pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. But then a miracle happened. I heard the sound of another car approaching. The cops looked at each other, panicked. "We have to go," the tall one said. They jumped into their car and sped off, leaving me cuffed and lying on the ground. The other car stopped, and a man got out. He was a truck driver who had seen the squad car and decided to check what was going on. He freed me from the cuffs and drove me to the nearest town, where I reported everything to the real police. It turned out those cops were part of a corrupt group involved in various illegal activities, and they thought I was a witness who could expose them. They were arrested and charged, but the whole experience left me shaken. I was deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, studying rare plants for my research project. I'd been out there for weeks, camping and hiking through dense woods. The isolation was peaceful, the only sounds being birds and the rustling of leaves. I loved it out there, feeling like I was the only person in the world. One morning, I set off to a new area I hadn't explored yet. My map showed it as a dense patch of forest, likely to have the rare species I was looking for. It was a long hike, but I didn't mind. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of wildflowers. Hours passed as I carefully collected samples and took notes. As the day wore on, I noticed signs of recent human activity. Fresh tire tracks and broken branches made me uneasy. I hadn't seen anyone else for days and wasn't expecting company. I pushed on, hoping it was just some off-roaders passing through. I was wrong. I heard the sound of chainsaws in the distance, cutting through the silence. My heart sank. Illegal loggers were the last thing I wanted to encounter. I knew they could be dangerous, not wanting anyone to interfere with their operations. I decided to avoid them and take a longer route back to my camp. But fate wasn't on my side. I stumbled upon a clearing where several men were cutting down trees. They spotted me before I could back away. I froze, trying to think of what to say. One of the men, a big guy with a scar across his face, shouted at me to stop. The others turned to look, their expressions hostile. He approached me, asking who I was and what I was doing there. I tried to explain that I was just a botanist, studying plants for my research, but he didn't believe me. He accused me of being a government agent, there to spy on them and shut down their operation. I tried to deny it, but he wasn't listening. The other men surrounded me, their eyes filled with suspicion and anger. I could feel the tension in the air, and I knew I was in serious trouble. They started arguing about what to do with me. Some wanted to let me go, but others thought I'd report them. The scar-faced guy seemed to be in charge, and he wasn't convinced by my pleas. They decided to take me to their camp deeper in the forest. They tied my hands and marched me through the woods, my mind racing with fear. I knew I had to find a way to escape, but I didn't know how. They were armed with axes and chainsaws, and I had nothing. At their camp, they threw me into a small, makeshift hut and locked the door. I could hear them talking outside, discussing what to do with me. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to make out their plans. They were worried I'd bring the authorities down on them, and some were suggesting getting rid of me for good. I had to act fast. I looked around the hut for anything I could use to free myself. My hands were tied, but not too tightly. I managed to wriggle one hand free and untie the ropes. There was a small window at the back of the hut, just big enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed out, trying to be as quiet as possible. The forest was dark, the sun having set while I was their prisoner. I moved slowly, avoiding the campfire's light and staying in the shadows. I could hear them laughing and talking, unaware that I was escaping. My heart raced as I crept away, every twig snapping underfoot making me flinch. I knew I couldn't go back to my camp. They'd find me there. I needed to get to the nearest town and find help. I remembered the direction I came from and started moving as quickly as I could through the dense forest. My legs ached, and I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. Hours passed, and I kept moving, my fear driving me forward. I stumbled and fell several times, but I got back up and kept going. The forest seemed endless, and I felt like I was running in circles. But then I saw lights in the distance, the faint glow of a town. Relief washed over me as I staggered towards the lights. I burst out of the forest onto a road, waving frantically at the first car I saw. The driver stopped, and I explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a rush. They took me to the local sheriff's office, where I finally felt safe. I told the authorities everything, and they organized a search party to find the loggers. I never found out what happened to them, but I was just glad to be alive. My research project was put on hold, and I left the Pacific Northwest, the memory of that terrifying encounter forever etched in my mind. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now held a darker meaning for me. I live in this small town in Tennessee, where everybody knows everybody else's business. It's the kind of place where secrets don't stay buried for long. My father passed away a few months ago, and it was only after his death that I started uncovering the truth about his past. I always knew my dad was a bit shady, but I never realized the extent of his involvement in organized crime until now. It started with a few whispers around town, rumors about my dad's connections to some unsavory characters. At first, I didn't want to believe it. My dad was my hero, my role model. He worked hard to provide for our family, and I couldn't imagine him being mixed up in anything illegal. But the more I dug, the more evidence I found to the contrary. I found old newspaper clippings, police reports, even photos of my dad with known criminals. It was like peeling back layers of a rotten onion, each layer revealing something darker and more sinister than the last. I confronted my mom about it, but she just brushed it off, saying it was all in the past and didn't matter anymore. But it did matter. It mattered a lot. I started hearing things, whispers in the dark, threats against me and my family. I knew I had to do something, had to distance myself from my father's legacy before it consumed me too. I tried to leave town, to start fresh somewhere else, but they wouldn't let me. They followed me, watching my every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, I came home to find my house ransacked, my belongings strewn about like confetti. I knew then that I was in over my head, that I couldn't outrun my father's past. I tried to reach out to the authorities, but they turned a blind eye, saying there was nothing they could do without concrete evidence. But I knew better. I knew they were in on it too, that they were just as corrupt as the criminals they were supposed to be fighting against. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, with no way out. Every time I turned around, there they were, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip up so they could pounce. I started sleeping with one eye open, jumping at every little sound. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my own friends. It was like I was living in a constant state of fear and paranoia. Then, one night, they finally made their move. I was out for a walk, trying to clear my head, when they jumped me from behind. They beat me within an inch of my life, leaving me lying in a pool of my own blood. But I refused to give up. I fought back with everything I had, clawing and scratching and biting until they finally backed off. It was a close call, but I managed to escape with my life. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay in that town any longer. I packed up what little I had left and hit the road, never looking back. I was on a guided safari in South Africa, excited to see the wildlife up close. We were in a large group, riding in an open-top jeep, with our guide explaining the different animals and plants. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds and insects. I had my camera ready, hoping to capture some great shots. We stopped at a clearing to take some photos of a herd of elephants in the distance. Our guide told us to stay close, but I wandered a bit to get a better angle. I didn't realize how far I had gone until I couldn't hear the voices of the group anymore. When I turned around, the jeep was gone. Panic set in as I realized I was alone. I started walking in the direction I thought they had gone, but the landscape looked the same in every direction. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew I needed to find them before dark. My heart was pounding, and I felt the fear rising. I shouted for help, but there was no response. As I was walking, I heard voices. Relieved, I headed towards the sound, thinking I had found my group. But as I got closer, I realized these were not the voices of my fellow tourists. These were rough, angry voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. I crouched behind some bushes and peered through the leaves. I saw a group of men with rifles, standing around a jeep. They were talking heatedly and gesturing towards something on the ground. My blood ran cold when I saw the carcass of a rhinoceros, its horn sawed off. These were poachers, and they had just killed the animal. I knew I had to get away before they saw me. I started to back away slowly, but I stepped on a dry twig, and it snapped loudly. One of the men turned towards the sound. I froze, hoping he wouldn't see me. But he did. He shouted to the others, and they all looked in my direction. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the dense brush. I could hear them shouting and the sound of their footsteps behind me. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. I knew if they caught me, I wouldn't survive. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I spotted a large tree with low branches and scrambled up, hoping they wouldn't see me. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The men ran past, not noticing me hidden in the foliage. I waited until I couldn't hear their voices anymore before climbing down. I knew I couldn't stay there. They would come back and find me. I started moving again, more cautiously this time. I kept to the shadows, trying to stay hidden. The sun had set completely, and the darkness made it even harder to navigate. I tripped over roots and rocks, my fear growing with each passing minute. Eventually, I heard the sound of running water. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to safety. I found a small stream and drank deeply, trying to calm my nerves. I sat by the water, trying to think of my next move. My mind was clouded with fear and exhaustion. As I sat there, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I looked around frantically, trying to find a place to hide. But it was too late. The poachers had found me. They surrounded me, their faces twisted with anger. One of them grabbed me by the arm and yanked me to my feet. He shouted something in my face, but I couldn't understand. He pointed his rifle at me, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I thought this was the end. But then, I heard another voice shouting in the distance. The poachers looked up, their expressions changing from anger to fear. I realized it was the voice of my guide, calling out for me. The poachers exchanged glances and then fled into the night. Moments later, my guide and the rest of the group burst through the trees. They were shouting my name, and I cried out in relief. The guide ran over to me, asking if I was okay. I was shaking, but I managed to nod. We made our way back to the jeep, and I couldn't stop shaking. The guide explained that they had noticed I was missing and had been searching for me. I told them about the poachers, and the guide reported it to the authorities. That night, back at the lodge, I couldn't sleep. The fear and adrenaline were still coursing through me. I kept thinking about how close I had come to not making it out alive. The experience had shaken me to my core. The authorities assured us they would investigate the poachers, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I was grateful to be safe, but I knew I would never forget the terror of that night in the South African wilderness. I was driving through rural Georgia, rain pouring down so hard I could barely see the road ahead. My windshield wipers were on full speed, but it didn't help much. I was tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It had been a long day, and all I wanted was to reach my motel and get some rest. Up ahead, I saw a car on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. A woman stood next to it, waving her arms frantically. She looked drenched and desperate. I hesitated for a moment, but then I decided to pull over. It didn't feel right to leave her out there in the storm. I rolled down my window a crack. "Do you need help?" I shouted over the sound of the rain. "Yes, please," she called back. "My car won't start. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" I nodded and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in, dripping water all over the seat. I noticed she was shivering, and her clothes were soaked through. I felt a pang of sympathy. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been out there for almost an hour." "No problem," I replied, trying to be reassuring. "Where's the nearest gas station?" "Just a few miles down the road," she said. "It's not far." I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. The rain was relentless, hammering against the roof and windows. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the car palpable. Suddenly, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. A dark figure appeared from the shadows, running towards my car. I barely had time to react before the back door was yanked open, and a man climbed in, brandishing a gun. "Don't move," he snarled, pointing the weapon at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at him, fear gripping me. "Keep driving," the woman ordered, her tone now cold and commanding. "Do exactly as we say, and you won't get hurt." I nodded, my hand shaking on the wheel. I felt trapped, panic rising as I realized I had fallen into a trap. They had planned this, using the woman as bait. "Where do you want me to go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Turn left up ahead," the man instructed. "There's a dirt road. Take it." I did as I was told, my mind racing. I had to find a way out of this. The dirt road was muddy and slick, making it hard to keep control of the car. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. "Stop here," the woman said abruptly. I brought the car to a halt, my heart pounding. The man kept the gun trained on me as the woman got out, motioning for me to follow. "Get out," she commanded. I slowly opened my door and stepped into the rain, the mud sucking at my shoes. They led me to a small clearing, where two more men were waiting by an old, beat-up van. "Hand over your keys," the man with the gun ordered. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling them out and tossing them to him. He caught them and handed them to one of the other men. "Take his car," he said. "We'll deal with him here." Panic surged through me. I knew I had to act fast. As they turned towards the van, I made a split-second decision. I bolted, sprinting into the trees. Shouts erupted behind me, and I heard the sound of footsteps chasing after me. The forest was dense, branches scratching in my face and clothes as I ran. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the rain making everything slippery. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear them behind me, getting closer. I spotted a large fallen tree up ahead and dove behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I heard them cursing, their voices angry and frustrated. "Spread out," one of them shouted. "He can't have gone far." I stayed as still as possible, praying they wouldn't find me. I could hear them moving through the forest, searching. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I needed a plan. I noticed a small creek nearby, its water rushing from the rain. An idea formed in my mind. If I could follow the creek, maybe I could lose them and find my way back to the road. I waited until their voices faded a bit, then carefully crept towards the water. I moved as quietly as I could, the sound of the creek covering my footsteps. The cold water soaked through my shoes, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I followed the creek for what felt like an eternity, my senses on high alert for any sign of my pursuers. Finally, I saw a break in the trees up ahead. I picked up the pace, hoping it was the road. As I emerged from the forest, relief washed over me. The road was just a few yards away. I scrambled up the embankment and onto the pavement, looking around frantically. There was no sign of the carjackers. I started running down the road, not sure where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between myself and them as possible. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights approaching. I waved my arms, praying it was someone who could help. The car slowed down and stopped beside me. An older man rolled down the window, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Please," I gasped. "I need help. I was attacked." "Get in," he said, unlocking the door. "I'll take you to the nearest police station." I climbed into the car, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back, half expecting to see the carjackers emerge from the darkness. But the road remained empty. At the police station, I told them everything. They took my statement and assured me they would search for the criminals. I knew it would be difficult to catch them, but I was grateful to be safe. That night, as I lay in a cheap motel room, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing everything. The rain still pounded against the window, a reminder of the terrifying encounter I had survived. It was just another routine night at the airport. I was part of the ground crew, responsible for loading and unloading cargo from the planes that came and went throughout the day and night. But that night, things took a terrifying turn that I never saw coming. As I was doing my rounds, I noticed something strange out on the tarmac. There was a plane parked in one of the remote stands, its cargo hold open and empty. But what caught my attention was the figure lurking around the plane, fiddling with something inside. At first, I thought it might be one of my colleagues, but as I got closer, I realized that it was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't belong there. I approached cautiously, trying not to make any noise as I crept closer to get a better look. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were several men inside the cargo hold, loading boxes onto the plane. But these weren't just any boxes, they were filled with contraband, illegal goods that were being smuggled in and out of the country. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that confronting these men could be dangerous. They were armed and clearly not afraid to use force to get what they wanted. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing while they broke the law right under my nose. I had to act, and I had to act fast. I took a deep breath and stepped out from my hiding spot, confronting the men and demanding to know what they were doing. At first, they were taken aback, surprised to see me there. But their surprise quickly turned to anger as they realized that I had caught them in the act. They tried to intimidate me, threatening me with violence if I didn't leave them alone. But I stood my ground, refusing to back down. That's when things took a turn for the worse. One of the men lunged at me, grabbing me by the collar and pinning me against the side of the plane. I struggled against him, trying to break free, but he was too strong. I could feel the panic rising inside me as I realized that I was completely at their mercy. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. It was the airport security team, responding to my distress call. The smugglers released me and tried to make a run for it, but they were quickly apprehended by the security team. As they were led away in handcuffs, I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be alive. The wind howled through the rugged landscape of the Scottish Highlands as I trudged along, my backpack heavy with supplies for my solo camping trip. I had chosen a remote spot, far from civilization, where I could truly immerse myself in the beauty and solitude of nature. But as I ventured deeper into the wilderness, I stumbled upon something that sent shivers down my spine: an abandoned campsite, nestled among the trees, with no sign of its former occupants. Curiosity mingled with unease as I approached the site, my heart pounding in my chest. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle or distress, just an empty campfire ring and a tattered tent flapping in the wind. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh bloodstains splattered across the ground, dark against the pristine white snow. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Had the previous campers been attacked by wild animals? Had they fallen victim to some other, more sinister fate? I scanned the surrounding area, my senses on high alert, but there was no sign of anyone else nearby. I was alone in the wilderness, with no one to turn to for help. Fear gnawed at the edges of my mind as I realized that I was not safe here, that whoever or whatever had left behind those bloodstains could still be lurking nearby, waiting to strike. I made a hasty decision to abandon my plans and leave the campsite behind, my heart pounding with every step as I retraced my path through the snow-covered forest. But as I hurried along, a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking my every move from the shadows. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing moment. It was as if the very air around me was thick with malevolence, as if some unseen force was closing in on me from all sides. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the trees like a warning from the depths of the forest. My blood ran cold as I realized that I was now alone out here, that there was something out there in the darkness, something dangerous and hungry and all too real. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted through the snow, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever lurked in the shadows. But no matter how fast I ran, the growling persisted, growing louder and more menacing with each passing moment. It was as if the very earth itself was alive with the sound of impending doom. I stumbled and fell, the icy ground biting into my hands and knees as I struggled to regain my footing. But as I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a pair of glowing eyes, shining like twin beacons in the darkness, fixed on me with unblinking intensity. I froze, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty, as the creature emerged from the shadows, a massive wolf, its fur bristling with menace as it advanced towards me with slow, deliberate steps. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away from the creature, but it was no use. I was trapped, alone and defenseless in the wilderness, with nowhere to run and no one to help me. But just as the wolf lunged at me, teeth bared and claws extended, I heard another sound, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle, growing louder and louder with each passing moment. I held my breath as the headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the forest with their brilliant glare. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows like a wraith. I collapsed to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I had been saved by the timely arrival of a passing car, whose occupants had come to my rescue just in the nick of time. As they helped me to my feet and led me back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, that I had come face to face with something ancient and primal and utterly terrifying in the heart of the Scottish Highlands. But as I looked back at the abandoned campsite, now nothing more than a dark silhouette against the snowy landscape, I knew that I would never forget the horrors I had witnessed there, or the chilling realization that I was now alone in the wilderness, not by a long shot. I was driving through New Mexico, heading back home after visiting my sister. The roads were empty, and the vast desert stretched out endlessly on either side. It was peaceful, in a way, but also a bit eerie. I had been driving for hours and still had a long way to go. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, I noticed a group of bikers in my rearview mirror. There were about 6 of them, and they were writing information, looking like something out of a movie. At first, I didn't think much of it. Bikers traveled these roads all the time. After a while, though, they started getting closer. I could hear the roar of their engines growing louder. They spread out, some riding beside me, some behind. It felt like they were surrounding my car. I glanced over at one of the bikers and saw him staring right back at me, a smirk on his face. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to keep calm and focus on the road, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The bikers began to weave in and out of their formation, coming closer to my car. One of them revved his engine loudly, making me jump. I decided to speed up a little, hoping to put some distance between us. But they matched my speed easily. One of them pulled up beside my window and shouted something I couldn't hear over the noise of the engines. He laughed and sped ahead, the others following. For a moment, I thought they were leaving me alone. But then they slowed down, forcing me to slow down too. I was trapped in the middle of them, my heart pounding. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. The bikers continued to toy with me, speeding up and slowing down, getting dangerously close to my car. I could see their faces now, grinning and menacing. They were enjoying this, whatever this was. I felt a rising sense of panic. I had to do something. I remembered seeing a gas station a few miles back and decided to head there. I hoped there would be people around, someone who could help. I took the next exit and headed towards the gas station, praying the bikers wouldn't follow. But they did. As I pulled into the gas station, the bikers surrounded my car again. There was no one else in sight, and the place looked deserted. My heart sank. I was on my own. I parked near the entrance and quickly got out of the car, trying to act like I wasn't scared out of my mind. The bikers dismounted and followed me, their boots crunching on the gravel. One of them, a tall guy with a beard and a leather jacket, stepped forward. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You lost or something?" I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "Just getting gas." I walked towards the entrance of the gas station, but he grabbed my arm, stopping me. His grip was strong, and I could feel his callous fingers digging into my skin. "Not so fast," he said, pulling me closer. The other bikers laughed. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I had to get away. I yanked my arm free and made a run for it, heading towards the back of the gas station. I could hear them chasing after me, their boots pounding on the ground. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. I spotted a narrow alley between the gas station and an old storage building. I squeezed through, hoping they wouldn't be able to follow. But they did. I could hear them shouting, their voices echoing off the walls. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I reached the end of the alley and found myself in an open field, nowhere to hide. I had to keep running. The bikers were gaining on me. I could feel their presence behind me, closing in. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I stumbled and nearly fell, but managed to keep going. Suddenly, I saw a car coming down the road in the distance. It was my only hope. I ran towards it, waving my arms and shouting for help. The bikers were right behind me, but I didn't look back. I focused on the car, willing it to see me. The car slowed down as it got closer, and I saw a man inside, looking confused. I ran up to the driver's side window, pounding on it and begging for help. The man looked at me, then at the bikers approaching, and his eyes widened. He unlocked the door, and I jumped in, slamming it shut behind me. "Drive!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The man didn't hesitate. He hit the gas, and we sped away, leaving the bikers behind. I glanced back and saw them standing there, looking furious. The man drove for a while before finally pulling over. He asked me what had happened, and I told him everything, my voice trembling. He offered to take me to the nearest police station, and I gratefully accepted. I knew I couldn't stay out here on my own. At the police station, I filed a report and gave them a description of the bikers. They said they would look into it, but I didn't have much hope. I was just glad to be safe. The man who had helped me offered to drive me the rest of the way to my destination, and I thanked him, feeling a bit more at ease. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had settled in my chest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the bikers to appear again. But they didn't. I finally reached my destination and thanked the man profusely for his help. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bikers' faces, heard their laughter. I knew it would take a long time to get over what had happened, but I was grateful to be alive. I decided to be more careful in the future, to trust my instincts and never stop for strangers again. Last summer, I went to a music festival in California with a group of friends. It was supposed to be an amazing weekend, 3 days of music, camping, and fun. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents, danced to our favorite bands, and made a lot of memories. The crowd was huge, and it was easy to get lost in it, but we all stuck together. On the second day, things took a turn. In the afternoon, we were all at the main stage. The sun was blazing, and the music was loud. I remember we were dancing when I suddenly lost sight of my friends. It was packed, and I got pushed by the crowd. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. I tried to find them, but it was hopeless. I walked around for what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, but there was no signal. I was getting more anxious by the minute. The sun started to set, and the crowd was getting rowdier. I felt alone and vulnerable. That's when a man approached me. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a friendly smile and a calm voice. He asked if I was okay. I told him I lost my friends and couldn't find them. He offered to help me look for them. At that moment, I was grateful. He seemed kind, and I didn't know what else to do. We walked together, weaving through the crowd. He kept talking, trying to keep me calm. He asked about my friends, what they looked like, and where I had last seen them. I answered all his questions, thinking he was just being helpful. But then he suggested we go to a quieter area where it would be easier to hear my phone if it rang. Something felt off, but I was too scared and desperate to find my friends to think straight. We left the main area and walked toward the edge of the festival grounds. The music was distant now, and the crowd was thinning out. We reached a secluded spot near some trees. He said we should wait there for a bit, that maybe my friends would try to call or text. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a signal. That's when I noticed his demeanor change. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at me with a strange intensity. He moved closer, too close. Alarm bells went off in my head, and I knew I needed to get away from him. I made an excuse about needing to use the restroom and started to walk away. He grabbed my arm, not hard, but enough to scare me. He said it wasn't safe for me to go alone and that he would come with me. My heart was racing. I pulled my arm free and told him I'd be quick. I walked away fast, trying not to run and draw attention. Once I was out of sight, I started running. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. I found myself near the camping area, and I ducked behind a row of tents. I crouched down, trying to catch my breath and calm my nerves. I stayed hidden for a while, listening for any sign that he had followed me. It was dark now, and the festival lights were a faint glow in the distance. My phone finally picked up a signal, and I quickly texted my friends, telling them where I was and what had happened. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I saw familiar faces. My friends found me and hugged me tightly. I broke down, telling them everything. They were shocked and angry that someone had taken advantage of the situation. We went to the festival security and reported the man. They took it seriously and said they would look for him. The rest of the festival was a blur. I couldn't relax or enjoy the music anymore. We stuck together like glue, never letting anyone out of sight. When it was over, I was relieved to go home. The experience left me shaken. I thought about how easily things could have gone worse. I haven't been to a festival since. The thought of getting lost in a crowd again terrifies me. I had planned a solo camping trip in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. I wanted some time away from the city, from work, and just about everything else. The first couple of days were perfect. The forest was peaceful, the air was fresh, and I felt completely at ease. On the third day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I was enjoying the solitude and the sounds of nature. As I was hiking, I stumbled upon a small clearing. There, I saw a man in hunting gear, crouched down and fiddling with something on the ground. He looked up when he heard me approach. Our eyes met, and he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I nodded and tried to move on, but he called out to me. "Hey, you shouldn't be here. This is a restricted area." I apologized, said I didn't know, and turned to leave. But his next words stopped me cold. "Wait, what did you see?" "Nothing," I replied quickly. "I just walked in. I didn't see anything." He stared at me, his eyes hard and calculating. It made me uneasy, and I started to back away. He stood up, still watching me, and I decided to walk faster. As I made my way back to my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see anyone. When I got back, I packed up my gear, deciding it was time to leave. Something about that man just didn't sit right with me. I started hiking back towards my car, which was parked a few miles away. The sun was beginning to set, and the forest was growing darker. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I turned around and saw him. The hunter was following me, his face set in a grim expression. I broke into a run, the underbrush scratching at my legs and arms as I tore through the forest. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him. I could hear him crashing through the forest behind me, getting closer. My lungs burned, and I stumbled over a root, falling hard to the ground. I scrambled up, but he was right there. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "You saw too much," he hissed. I fought back, kicking and scratching. I managed to break free and took off again, adrenaline giving me a burst of energy. I knew I had to hide, so I veered off the trail and found a thick cluster of bushes. I dove into them, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my breath, listening as he ran past me. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When I finally dared to peek out, it was dark, and the forest was silent. I knew I couldn't stay there all night, so I crept out and started making my way towards where I thought the road was. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I was terrified he would find me again. I moved as quietly as I could, trying to stay off the main path. The darkness made it hard to see, and I stumbled often, but I kept going. Finally, I saw the faint glow of headlights through the trees. I hurried towards them, desperate for help. As I broke through the tree line, I saw a car parked on the side of the road. I waved my arms, shouting for help. The driver got out, a middle-aged woman who looked shocked to see me. I told her someone was after me, and she ushered me into her car. She drove me to the nearest town, and I called the police from there. The authorities searched the forest but didn't find the hunter. They did find signs of illegal hunting activity in the area, but the man was long gone. I gave them a description, but I never heard anything more about it. That experience left me shaken. I still love the outdoors, but I'm much more cautious now. I always let someone know where I'm going and when I'll be back. I moved to a small town in Vermont a few months ago. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and I thought it would be a good place to start over. The house I bought was old but charming, a fixer-upper that I thought would keep me busy and give me something to focus on. One afternoon, I was clearing out the basement. There was a lot of junk left by the previous owner, mostly old furniture and boxes of miscellaneous stuff. As I was moving a heavy wardrobe, I noticed something strange about the wall behind it. It sounded hollow when I knocked on it. Curious, I moved the wardrobe aside and found a small door, almost like a hatch. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down to what looked like a hidden room. I hesitated, feeling a chill run down my spine, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully made my way down. The room was small, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. In the middle of the room was a table covered with dust, and on it were stacks of old photos and documents. I picked up a few and started to look through them. What I saw made my blood run cold. The photos were of people, mostly women and children, in various states of distress. Some were bound, some were unconscious, and some looked like they were screaming. The documents were detailed records, listing names, ages, and disturbing notes about each person. It became clear that the previous owner of my house had been involved in something horrifying: human trafficking. I felt sick to my stomach. My first instinct was to call the police, but as I reached for my phone, I heard a noise upstairs. Someone was in the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I quietly turned off my flashlight and tried to stay as silent as possible. I could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the rooms above me. I realized I had left the hatch door open. Whoever was up there would find it eventually. I needed to get out, but the only way was back up the stairs, where the intruder was. I looked around the room for something to defend myself with and found an old, rusty pipe. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I crept up the stairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the basement door. I held my breath, clutching the pipe tightly. The door creaked open, and I saw a shadow on the wall. I waited until the person was halfway down the stairs before I swung the pipe as hard as I could. The man fell with a grunt, tumbling down the stairs. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious or not. I ran up the stairs, through the house, and out the front door. I sprinted to my neighbor's house, banging on the door until they let me in. I told them what happened, and they called the police. The police arrived quickly and searched my house. They found the man in the basement, unconscious but alive. He was arrested and taken away. The officers spent hours going through the hidden room, collecting the photos and documents as evidence. They told me I had stumbled upon a major breakthrough in a long-running human trafficking investigation. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, those terrified faces. The police assured me that I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The man they arrested wasn't the previous owner of the house. He was likely one of many involved in this operation. I wondered how many more were out there, and if they knew about me. Over the next few days, the police kept me updated on their investigation. They told me the previous owner had been under suspicion for years but had managed to evade capture. The documents I found provided crucial information that would help bring down the entire operation. It was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the images from my mind. The town was supportive, but I felt like an outsider, a stranger who had brought something dark into their peaceful community. I decided to sell the house and move away. It was too much to bear, living in a place with such a horrific past. Before I left, the police asked me to testify in court. I agreed, knowing it was the right thing to do. The trial was long and grueling, but in the end, justice was served. The previous owner and several others were sentenced to life in prison. I moved to a new town, far away from Vermont, hoping to leave the past behind. But the memories stayed with me, a constant reminder of the darkness that can hide behind closed doors. I found a new job, made new friends, and tried to build a new life. But I was never the same. The experience had changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the hidden evils in the world. In the end, I found some peace in knowing that I had helped stop something terrible. But the scars remained, a reminder of the day I uncovered the hidden horrors in my own home. I had been looking for a vintage guitar for a while, something with character and a bit of history. Craigslist seemed like a good place to start, so I spent a few evenings browsing through ads. One night, I found a listing that caught my eye. A beautiful 1960s Gibson, reasonably priced. I contacted the seller immediately. The guy's name was Rick. He responded quickly, and we arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Austin. When I got there, Rick was already waiting, guitar in hand. He seemed friendly enough, a bit rough around the edges, but nothing too alarming. The guitar was in great condition, just as the ad had described. We chatted for a bit, and after some negotiation, I handed over the cash and took the guitar. As I was leaving, Rick asked if I lived nearby. I mentioned I was just a few miles away, in an attempt to make small talk. He nodded and said he hoped I enjoyed the guitar. I thought nothing of it and went on my way. When I got home, I couldn't wait to play. The guitar sounded amazing, even better than I had hoped. I spent the next few hours lost in music, completely forgetting about the world outside. It was late when I finally put the guitar down and decided to call it a night. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was moving around near my driveway. I peeked through the blinds and saw a shadowy figure near my car. My heart started racing. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or maybe a neighbor, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I turned off all the lights and stayed quiet, watching the figure. After a few minutes, the person moved closer to the house. I could see them more clearly now. It was Rick. He was trying to look through the windows, checking if anyone was home. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the intruder. They told me to stay calm and stay on the line until the police arrived. Rick started to move towards the back door, jiggling the handle. I could hear him cursing under his breath. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't get in. The minutes felt like hours. Then, I heard sirens in the distance. Rick must have heard them too because he bolted, running back towards the street. I stayed on the line until the police arrived, explaining everything to them as best as I could. The officers searched the area but didn't find Rick. They took my statement and assured me they would patrol the neighborhood for the next few nights. They advised me to keep my doors and windows locked and to call them if I saw anything suspicious. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little noise made me jump. I decided to take some time off work and stay with a friend for a few days. I didn't feel safe at home. While I was away, I got a call from the police. They had caught Rick. Apparently, he had tried to pull the same stunt on someone else, but this time, the person fought back and managed to detain him until the cops arrived. They found several stolen items in his possession, including a few guitars. Hearing this brought some relief, but I still felt uneasy. I went back home, changed all the locks, and installed a security system. It took a while to feel comfortable in my own house again. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me more cautious. From then on, I was careful about who I dealt with, especially online. I never met strangers alone, always choosing public places with lots of people around. The guitar, as beautiful as it was, became a reminder of that terrifying night. I kept it, but every time I played, I couldn't help but think about how close I came to real danger. In the end, I was lucky. I got out safe, and Rick was caught. It was pouring rain, the kind that makes it hard to see even a few feet ahead. I was driving through the middle of nowhere in the Midwest, trying to get home after visiting my folks. The road was empty, not a car in sight, just endless fields on either side. The wipers were working overtime, but visibility was still terrible. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure by the side of the road, drenched and holding out a thumb. A hitchhiker. I never pick up hitchhikers, but something about the storm and the sheer desolation of the place made me stop. The guy looked harmless enough, maybe in his early 20s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. I rolled down the window a bit and asked him where he was headed. He said he was trying to get to a town about 50 miles down the road. He seemed friendly, grateful even. So, I unlocked the door and let him in. He climbed into the passenger seat, thanking me profusely. We drove in silence for a while, the rain pounding on the roof. He introduced himself as Jake, said he was coming back from visiting his sick mother. I nodded, made small talk about the weather, the storm. He seemed normal, a bit quiet, but nothing out of the ordinary. About 20 minutes into the drive, things started to change. Jake shifted in his seat, looking around nervously. He asked if we could take a detour, said he needed to pick something up from a friend's place. I told him it was late, and I wanted to get home, but he insisted. His voice had a new edge to it, almost demanding. I tried to brush it off, saying I didn't have time for detours. That's when he snapped. His friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, hard look. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a knife, holding it close to his side where I could see it but not easily reach it. "You're gonna drive where I tell you," he said, his voice low and threatening. My heart started pounding. This wasn't the friendly guy I had picked up. This was someone dangerous. I nodded, trying to keep calm. "All right, where do you need to go?" I asked, my voice shaking. He gave me directions, telling me to take a series of turns that led us off the main road and onto a smaller, dirt path. The road was rough, and the rain was making it worse. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the silence in the car heavy and tense. I kept glancing at him, trying to figure out a way out of this. The knife never left his hand, and his eyes were fixed on me, making sure I didn't try anything. Finally, we reached a clearing in the woods. There was an old, abandoned barn in the middle of the clearing. He told me to stop the car and get out. I did as he said, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. The barn looked like it hadn't been used in years, and there was no sign of anyone else around. He got out too, walking around to my side, the knife still in his hand. "We're gonna go inside," he said, nodding towards the barn. I had no choice but to follow. The rain was still coming down hard, making everything slippery and cold. Inside the barn, it was dark and smelled of damp and rot. Jake told me to sit down on an old crate while he rummaged through his backpack. I took the chance to look around, hoping for something I could use to defend myself. There was nothing, just old, broken tools and piles of hay. He pulled out some rope from his bag and tossed it to me. "Tie your feet," he ordered, pointing the knife at me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it, but I did as he said. He came over and checked the knots, then tied my hands behind my back. I asked him why he was doing this, trying to keep him talking, hoping to buy some time. He just smiled, a twisted, cold smile that sent chills down my spine. He didn't answer, just paced back and forth, occasionally glancing out the barn door. Minutes felt like hours. I tried to think of a way to escape, but with my hands and feet tied, there wasn't much I could do. The rain was still pounding outside, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Suddenly, he walked over to me and leaned in close, the knife pressed against my throat. "We're gonna wait here until morning," he said. "And if you try anything, I'll make sure you regret it." His breath was hot against my face, and I could see the madness in his eyes. I nodded, too scared to speak. He backed off, settling down on another crate, keeping the knife in his hand. I sat there, soaked and terrified, trying to figure out how I could get out of this alive. Hours passed, and he eventually dozed off, the knife slipping from his hand. I saw my chance. Slowly, I worked at the knots around my wrists, praying he wouldn't wake up. It took forever, but finally, I managed to free my hands. I looked around, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon. I found a rusty old pitchfork leaning against the wall. Quietly, I grabbed it, my heart pounding in my chest. I inched closer to him, the pitchfork raised, ready to strike. But just as I was about to make my move, he stirred and opened his eyes. He saw the pitchfork and lunged at me, but I was faster. I swung it with all my strength, hitting him in the shoulder. He screamed in pain, dropping the knife. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, my legs barely holding me up, out into the rain and towards my car. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open and jumping inside. I started the engine and tore out of there, the headlights barely cutting through the storm. I drove for miles, not daring to look back. Eventually, I found a gas station and called the police. They went to the barn, but by the time they got there, Jake was gone. They never found him, and I never heard anything more about him. I still have nightmares about that night, the rain, and the look in his eyes. I've never picked up another hitchhiker, and I never will. I decided to go camping alone near an abandoned cabin in the Sierra Nevada. I had heard about the spot from a friend who said it was a great place to get away from everything. I packed my gear, left a note for my brother, and set out. The drive up was beautiful, the mountains rising up around me, the air getting cooler as I climbed higher. When I reached the area, I parked my car at the end of a dirt road and hiked a couple of miles to the cabin. It looked just like my friend had described, old, weathered wood, a sagging roof, and windows that were mostly broken. I set up my tent a little ways away, preferring the open space to the musty interior of the cabin. The first night was peaceful. The sounds of the forest were comforting, and the stars were incredibly bright. I had a small campfire going and roasted some hot dogs, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't felt in a while. I went to bed early, looking forward to a day of exploring the next morning. When I woke up, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around my campsite that hadn't been there before. They were fresh, and definitely not mine. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone else on my hike up, and the idea that someone had been near my camp while I slept was unsettling. I decided to investigate the cabin. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, and I could figure out what was going on. As I approached the cabin, I heard voices. Peeking through a gap in the wall, I saw a group of people inside. They looked rough, like they had been living out here for a while. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and they had a makeshift camp set up inside the cabin. I backed away slowly, not wanting to draw attention to myself. But as I turned to leave, I stepped on a twig, and it snapped loudly. The voices inside the cabin went silent, and then I heard someone shout, "Who's out there?" Panic surged through me, and I took off running back towards my campsite. I reached my tent and started packing up as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone coming after me. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw one of the men from the cabin standing there, watching me. "Hey," he said, his voice low and menacing. "What are you doing out here?" "I was just leaving," I stammered, trying to sound calm. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You shouldn't have come here," he said, taking a step closer. "This is our place." I nodded, slinging my pack over my shoulder. "I'm sorry. I'll go now." But as I tried to walk past him, he grabbed my arm. "Not so fast," he said. "We need to make sure you don't tell anyone about us." My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how much trouble I was in. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. The man called out, and 2 more men emerged from the trees. They surrounded me, and I knew I had to think fast. I decided to make a break for it. I shoved the man holding me as hard as I could and took off running. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, dodging through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept going. I stumbled upon a creek and followed it, hoping the water would cover my tracks. The noise of the water helped drown out their shouts, and I prayed they would lose my trail. After what felt like hours, the sounds of pursuit faded. I slowed down, exhausted and terrified. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I couldn't go back to my campsite. I needed to find help, but I was deep in the forest, miles from my car. As night fell, I found a spot to rest. I hid among some rocks, trying to stay out of sight. I didn't sleep much, too scared that they would find me. Every noise made me jump, but the night passed without incident. In the morning, I started moving again, keeping an eye out for any signs of the men. My legs were sore, and I was dehydrated, but I pushed on. Eventually, I found a trail that led me back towards the road where I had parked my car. When I finally saw my car in the distance, I almost cried with relief. I ran the last stretch, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. I drove back to the nearest town as fast as I could and went straight to the police. I told them everything, but when they went to check the cabin, it was empty. The men were gone, leaving no trace behind. The police said it was likely a group of squatters, and they would keep an eye out, but I knew they were long gone. I still think about that trip often. The sense of vulnerability, the fear, and the realization that I was completely alone out there. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into a nightmare. Now, whenever I go camping, I make sure I'm never alone. Working the late-night shift at the radio station had always been a bit eerie, but I loved the solitude. My name's Rick, and I've been a DJ for the past 5 years. Most nights, it was just me, the soundboard, and the occasional caller. I liked the calm and the chance to play whatever I wanted. One night, around 1 a.m., I got a call that changed everything. The phone rang, and I answered it as usual. The voice on the other end was low and rough. The guy didn't say much at first, just that he was a listener. He sounded strange, but I didn't think much of it. "Play something for me, Rick," he said. I asked what he wanted to hear. "Surprise me," he replied, and then hung up. I shrugged it off and played a random track. About 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same guy. "You've got good taste, Rick," he said. His voice made my skin crawl. "What else can you play for me?" I tried to engage him, but he kept his answers short, almost like he didn't want to talk, just listen. Then he hung up again. I started feeling uneasy, but it wasn't uncommon to get weird calls during the night shift. I shook it off and continued with my playlist. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang again. This time, he was more talkative. "I like your show, Rick," he said. "I can see why people listen to you." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. It felt like he was watching me. I laughed it off, asking him how he could see me through the radio. He didn't laugh. Instead, he said, "You should be careful, Rick. You never know who's out there." I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to get him to reveal more about himself, but he hung up again. I looked around the small studio, suddenly hyper-aware of the darkness outside the windows. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just a prank. Half an hour later, he called again. This time, he was angry. "You didn't play the song I wanted," he growled. I reminded him that he hadn't requested anything specific. He was silent for a moment, then said, "I'm closer than you think, Rick. I'm watching." My heart was pounding now. I stood up and locked the studio door, checking the windows again. They were dark, the parking lot outside dimly lit by a single street lamp. I tried to shake off the fear and keep the show going, but my hands were trembling. The next call came just after 3 a.m. He was calm again, almost too calm. "I'm outside, Rick. Why don't you come out and see me?" My throat went dry. I didn't respond, just hung up the phone and called the police. They said they'd send a car to check the area. I stayed on the air, trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the caller. Was he really outside, or was he just messing with me? I decided to take a look. I turned off the mic and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, under the street lamp, I saw a figure. He was just standing there, looking up at the building. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I backed away from the window, feeling a surge of panic. The phone rang again, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I didn't want to answer, but I had to. I picked it up with a shaking hand. "Did you see me, Rick?" His voice was almost gleeful. "I see you." I slammed the phone down and backed into the corner of the studio, feeling trapped. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept glancing at the clock, willing the police to arrive. Finally, I saw the flashing red and blue lights outside. The figure under the street lamp disappeared into the shadows. I ran to the door and unlocked it, practically throwing myself outside as the officers approached. I explained everything to them, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They searched the area but found nothing. The figure was gone. They told me to stay inside and lock the doors, that they'd keep a car outside for the rest of my shift. I went back to the studio, but I couldn't focus. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and anxiety. I kept expecting the phone to ring, but it stayed silent. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran to my car, the police following me home to make sure I was safe. I didn't sleep that day, or the next. The fear stayed with me, the memory of that voice and the figure under the street lamp haunting my thoughts. I took a few days off, hoping the distance would help, but the paranoia lingered. When I finally went back to work, the fear hadn't left. Every ring of the phone made my heart race, every shadow outside the window made me jump. I don't know if he'll ever come back, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting,